Okay, we are live on MythVision podcast. I have Professor Steve Mason, Dr. Steve Mason. He's in the eternal city, Rome. Welcome back to MythVision, my friend.
Ciao. Buongiorno.
I haven't been yet, and I can't wait to go myself at some point. Fair warning, compared to other live streams we've done, he is on Wi-Fi. He is renting a spot, so if he's pixelated, look, you only see through a glass dimly, but only when that which is perfect has come will you see eye to eye, right, or face to face. Steve, thank you for giving us your time. And while you're in Rome, to join us and educate us, we're going to be dealing with the aftermath of the Judean war with Rome and some of the desert fortresses. I know we're going to learn something new. There's not a single episode that you and me don't learn something. I want to go ahead and do a quick little intro promo, so to speak, letting people know what's the deal, what's happening here. You can join the Patreon. You can support us there and access anything early. And if you're struggling, it's only $3 a month to get in the door and be able to access everything. Seriously, I want to make that accessible to anybody who wants to do this. And so you get the inside scoop. You can also private message me and stuff like that. We're doing lots of stuff. I have 4 more videos with Delcy Allison Jr. I haven't even made public yet. All of this stuff is early bird access. And when I go to record with scholars and I have plenty of time with them, I even ask Patreon members, like, do you have a question for a scholar? And I'll record it in 4K, edit it up for you. I mean, for as simple as $3 a month. So I really appreciate the support. We also have a poll right now in the chat. Out of the 3 courses we've launched so far on MVP courses, Creating Jesus, Why Mark's Gospel Was Forgotten. It's been buried. It's been buried under Matthew, Luke, and John. If you read Mark for Mark and you've never read it that way, you will literally walk away going, oh my goodness, what they've done with the narrative is quite impressive. It's radically changed. The historical Jesus quest with Delcy Allison Jr., and in that, he takes you practically from the Protestant Reformation and their criticism of the miracle claims of the Roman Catholic Church all the way to modern critical scholarship. I mean, a scientific method was developed on how to analyze New Testament studies, and you see that development happen through historical figures like Ryan Morris, Schweitzer, you name it, David Friedrich Strauss, all the way down to E.P. Sanders and John Dominic Crossan, and of course, Dr. Allison and others. And there are other scholars, but he goes through some major players in history that will make you realize why we think the way we do in New Testament studies. Doesn't mean that we're right. Even today, we may be mistaken on many things, but you get the field. You understand the history of the field. That's what this one's about. And then, of course, with M. David Litwa, ancient Greek mystery cults, their practices, kind of their foundation myths, and then we compare Christianity in the 7th lecture to kind of give you Paul's language of mystery. Is this some kind of mystery cult? Is there something going on in the earliest movement that might equate to it? Sign up for these 3 courses. I've got Robin Faith Walsh coming. I've got Kip Davis coming. I've got Dennis R. McDonald on his Greek mimesis stuff. You can't miss it. And I've got another Egyptology course. I mean, look, all sorts of stuff is coming. So I'm hoping to put Dr. Mason on here at some point so you can take his course and let us know what you think there. Dr. Mason, you wrote all these books, and I have one in person right here on paperback. The others I have on ebook. What can we do? Is there some way that people can support what you're doing, or is it just get the books and spread the insight and let people know about them? Or
Hey, yeah, thanks, Derek. Yeah, not much to do really. It's up to people if they want to read this stuff. If they find it helpful, all the better. I don't really need support, but I'm really glad to have, what you've provided here is a way to reach a lot of people that wouldn't be in my classroom or I wouldn't come across in life otherwise. So for me, that's golden. That's great.
okay, well, I guess the best way to support Dr. Mason, and he told me this the first time we recorded, was more people watched that video the first time we ever recorded. he had more people click and with interest watched and enjoyed and really wanted to hear what he had to say than he's ever had students in the university. Because as you've painted the picture to me before, was some of these students are required to take your class in order to get to what they want to get to, because they're really like, I just got to get through this thing. I'm not really interested in this. People are voluntarily clicking your material saying, I want to know what this guy is teaching. I want to learn this material. They could click off at any point, but they want to watch. And I know that a lot of people who watch MythVision are a fan of what you do.
Hey, thanks very much, Derek. Well, I'm a big fan of what you do, and I've told you before, I think you're a terrific host, and that's not blowing smoke. That's just having worked with a bunch of, directors of documentaries and hosts and things like that. I think you do a good job. And part of that is that, you actually take what I'm talking about, allow it to come through. You edit it down to, convenient sound bites or something like that. So I really appreciate it. And it's great to be with your audience here.
Thank you.
From Rome today.
I'll say that again.
From Rome
yes.
today. Yeah,
yes,
from
the
center.
Eternal City.
If I could, if it weren't dark out already, I'd kind of show you out the window. It's some nice scenes, but it's dark already here, so I can't.
Well, I will try not to make you stay up all night on this stream today, because you know how you and me do. James Tabor pointed the same thing out to me, and he's like, Derek, there's something about what you do that I appreciate. And he said he's had a lot of documentary people that come to record, and what they like to do is tell you what they want you to say, and they only want what they want to be heard. And so they filter it out, they edit it out, they kind of cut it down, or they even will sometimes coerce the scholar to say stuff a certain way. Look, we want the raw Steve Mason, the raw James Tabor version, or whoever the scholar might be, to kind of convey that to the audience. And that's what we're doing here. So seriously, thank you.
This is a little bit controversial today, actually. It might not seem like it. I mean, desert fortresses, who really cares? Desert fortress, what's to talk about? But actually, if you've heard of Masada, then, you've heard some stuff. And I'm going to be probing the foundations of what we know and how we know it, actually. So, I hope nobody's offended. I hope there are some good questions, responses, but that's what I want to try to do.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. So stay tuned, everybody. We're about to take a deep dive. Thank you for everybody showing up in the chat. Hit the like button. And I'm ready when you are. Do you want me to go ahead and share the screen?
Yeah, please.
Okay. And I figured just for the sake of the episode, if anyone wants to ask questions, they could super chat them, and we'll get to them during Q&A at the end. I don't want to interrupt you if possible.
Okay. But please feel free to interrupt with a question. I mean, a voice question, I can, it's really good in a way to raise things along the way and not, get lost at the end. So feel free to do that.
What I'll do is then I'll filter if a super chat is relevant to the topic and they really want to have that question answered, then I'll try to do it while that topic's up. If it's something irrelevant to the presentation or something that kind of takes off track, I'll preserve it for Q&A.
Great. Sounds good.
Awesome.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
I can.
And can you see it in full screen mode?
Yes, we can.
Okay. You mentioned before there's a little bit of a delay, so apologies for the, there's nothing I can do to improve the internet in the place where I am right now, but we'll hope that it holds up. If there's a delay that, I get ahead of what's on the screen, just let me know and say slow down. Okay?
Oh, yes, sir.
So, there are, if I ask you, you heard of Masada, right, Derek, obviously. Most of your viewers probably have. But before we were talking, had you heard much about Machaerus?
No.
Right. No. That doesn't surprise me. Every time I've talked about this with an audience, I'll ask, how many have heard of Masada? Hands go up, everybody. How many have heard of Machaerus? Maybe one or two people. Look, what's that? What is that? Well, what I want to try to present today is reasons for thinking that the way this stuff is presented, usually there's always like a common view, a simple view that really needs to be untangled. And Machiris is a big part of that untangling, and you'll see what I mean. So here's a common view of the most common view of the Jewish war. In fact, here's a quotation from a book just out. Well, it was the end of 2021, came out. Very good book, fine book. I won't mention the author's name because my point is not to pick on the author or start a row, a fight. Row is the English side, but just to reflect what's a very common view of the war, right? It clearly took a massive effort for the Romans to defeat all of the Jewish rebels. The fighting lasted for 8 or 9 years, that is 66 to 74, 75. And there were thousands of Jewish, Roman, and other casualties. So this common view, I've colored it red because the picture that you get is that from 66 all the way to 74, you had 8 or 9 years of intensive fighting between Romans and Jews. It took the Romans that long to put down this ferocious Jewish revolt. At the end of that comes the desert fortresses, Machiris and especially Masada in the spring of 74. Well, the problem with this analysis is that a lot of it is based on the consequences of the war. The war had enormous consequences. So the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 for Jews, for Romans, for Christians, that was a monumental, momentous event. There's no doubt that this was one of the most consequential events in Western history. But that doesn't mean that it began from a major conflict. Now, we've talked a little bit about this before in other presentations, so I won't go over the entire war. We don't have time anyway. But what I want to put forward for, stimulation, and this is a little bit controversial, I suppose, but I think it's very clear. I don't see how it's able to be contradicted, is that the actual violent confrontations between Jews and Romans were limited to these red spots during the conflict. Why is that the case? Well, what we'll be looking at today is some later orange spots, Machiris and Masada. But just to fill in the blanks here, the reason is that in 66, there was an expedition from a Roman governor, Cestius Gallus, who came to Jerusalem. So that was a brief conflict, but there's hardly any fighting except that he was ambushed on the way out north. So that was clearly a bloody incident. And that's what kicked off the war. When Vespasian arrives, so Cestius Gallus dies in office and Vespasian arrives and takes over, he has a conflict in Galilee, but it's very brief. That's the siege of Yotapata and a little town called Jaffa. But otherwise, Galilee capitulates to him. The main city in Galilee, called Sepphoris, immediately welcomes Vespasian and requests a Roman garrison there. So this is the Judean capital of Galilee. Then he thinks he's all done. In the summer of 67, he thinks it's all finished. But King Agrippa, who was with him, says, "Can you help me out with a couple of my towns, Tiberias and Tariphea, and eventually Gamala, the natural fortress? Can you help me out with some rebels against me there, not against Rome, but against me?" And Vespasian, who's already sent his army to war, says, "Yeah, sure, I'll help you out." And so he does. And that's another little conflict, especially the siege of Gamala, which takes a few weeks. But that's it. And then in 68, 69, and the spring of 70, there's no real fighting. Why is that? Because in the summer of 68, Nero dies, and Vespasian has to halt his campaign while they figure out who's going to be the next emperor. because he was sent by Nero, right? So his mandate comes from the emperor. There's no emperor, so he has to wait. And he just hangs out in Judea to see what's going to happen. And that's the year of the four emperors, famously, right? Galba, Otto, Vitellius. And then finally, Vespasian decides in 69 he's going to bid for imperial power himself and use his campaign in Judea as a kind of springboard to show what a tough guy he is. And he goes to Alexandria and he leaves Titus to take over the siege of Jerusalem, which is really the only main event in the Judean War. And that lasts about 6 months. When it's done, as far as the Flavians are concerned, the war's over. So this idea that the war took, 8 or 9 years of intense fighting is kind of problematic because there was no fighting for most of the time. The siege of Jerusalem was the main thing. And in the next year, when the Flavians held their triumph in Rome, they exhibited famously all the spoils of Jerusalem and from the temple and so on. The war was over in 70. Now, back in Judea, Judea becomes now a province of its own, right? It hadn't been a province before. It had been part of Syria with a kind of junior governor, a procurator in the south, but under the control of the legate in Syria. Now it becomes a province of its own, and it gets its own senatorial governor named Carialis first. And then he's removed to Rome, and he's replaced by a guy named Bassus. Bassus finally says, you know what, it's time to take the fortresses back. We had these, as part of the province, there were several fortress sites, natural fortresses around the place, especially on the frontiers. And Rome hasn't taken them all back. Obviously, they were in no big hurry to do that, but they decide that they should take them back. And Bassus says, well, most important one is Machaerus, and that's over in modern Jordan today. And he says, so let's get that underway. And then he's about to plan to take the last one, Masada, when he dies in post, and his replacement is a guy named Flavius Silva. And so Silva comes out, and in the spring of 74, takes Masada. Famous story, of course, in Josephus is that while he's building the siege ramps and planning to overrun the place, well, he gets to the top and he burns through the gateway to get in, but decides to let that burn out overnight. And while he's waiting to attack the next day, the leader up on Masada, Eleazar ben Yair, gives a couple of big speeches which persuade everyone to kill themselves. Not exactly themselves, not in suicide, technically speaking, but to kill each other in a kind of pact, so that they're all dead except for 2 women and 5 children when the Romans arrive the next day. So that's the famous story. But I want to put it in a little bit of historical context here. So as far as the Romans are concerned, the war is over by the time all of this happens. That raises the question, when should we actually declare the war over? Well, as far as the Flavians were concerned, it was over in 70 for the very good reason that they needed, in order to make a bid for power in Rome, Vespasian needed to present himself as the man, right? In the Roman thinking, martial glory from war, from fighting, was the only kind of glory that really mattered at the end of the day. You could be a great accountant, you could be a great thinker, you could be a philosopher, but to be a real man and to stand up in war and kill enemies, especially with your own bare hands, that was really the ticket to toughness and being respected among your peers as somebody who could really rule. Now, young Nero, he came to power at 16. He didn't have that. And he was viewed as kind of effete, a kind of, he's very artistic. He loved to sing, act, perform. He went on a 1.5-year tour of Greece, doing all these artistic things. And he was really despised by the upper class in Rome. He may have been loved by the populace because he provided them with lots of stuff and made Rome kind of attractive and gave lots of employment. But he was hated by much of the aristocracy, and eventually had to commit suicide. So now the thing is that in Rome, there's no more room for the expansion of the empire, really, for conquering new territories. That had been the case in the late Roman Republic. Generals could add new territory to Rome's empire, and then all the way through to Augustus. He was still doing that, linking up the Eastern Mediterranean, conquering Egypt and Tiberias, settling issues in the northeast of the empire. So, and then Claudius with Britain, holding a triumph after his little brief visit there, while his generals sorted out a kind of stake in Britain. So it was all pretty much sewn up by the time Vespasian came along, and his competitors for power to become emperor couldn't really add anything to the empire. So there was a lot of disgruntlement about who should be the new leader, and that person needed some kind of legitimacy. And the kind of legitimacy you get from overthrowing your predecessor, in a coup, isn't really the kind you need. So Galba becomes emperor after Nero, but murdered in the Forum a few months later. Otto kills himself because he's engaged in a bitter civil war with Vitellius. Vitellius finally comes to power, but he's viewed as a drunken, dissipated glutton and so on. These guys are not really what Rome's looking for. So Vespasian comes along and says, well, hey, look, I've been out while these guys have been messing with each other, bumping each other off, having Roman army fight each other, which is disgraceful. I've been out there, banging heads for Rome, dealing with Rome's enemies. So what Vespasian really wanted to do was turn a provincial conflict in Syria, because Judea had been part of the Roman Empire for 130 years already, right? It was conquered by Pompey the Great back in 63 BCE. So it wasn't as if he was really able to add anything to the empire. But what he wanted to do was present his military achievements as proving he was the kind of guy who could really secure Rome's future. Now, he'd already been, I mentioned that Claudius celebrated for Britain, right? Claudius himself had only visited for a short time. Among his two main generals was Vespasian. Vespasian had the Second Augusta Legion out there, really nailing down Britain for Claudius, right? So he was a key person there. And then now he's commanded this campaign in Judea. He personally captured the so-called general, that is Josephus, up in Galilee. He was personally wounded in battle in the siege of Yotapa. And he's the one who planned Titus's victory. And
Dr. Mason, what was it? He got wounded where exactly again? You broke out.
Yeah, he got wounded in the siege of Yotapata, or Yodfat in the north, where Josephus was defending. That's why we know about it, because Josephus says, one of my men shot an arrow and hit Vespasian in the foot. And this caused great consternation among the Roman soldiers, who thought that he was, maybe mortally wounded. And Josephus has a little bit of fun at the Romans' expense, saying they all went into complete chaos. The legions, screaming and running around with their, like chickens with their heads cut off, saying, what are we going to do now? But it was actually not that big of a wound. And tough old Vespasian just got up and said, look, everybody calm down. It's not so bad. But so he's personally wounded. He takes prisoners, and then he finally sent his army. He didn't fight. He stayed in Alexandria, but he sent his army under Mucianus and Antonius Primus to go and fight Vitellius's troops and take Rome for the Flavians. So he's the only one who's able to cite these so-called foreign victories to earn credibility and end the civil war, right? Because he can say, no, I've been busy fighting Rome's enemies while you lot have been fighting each other. And then he tries to erase, he says, I'm in a position to erase the disgrace of Nero. So Nero, some of your listeners will know, your viewers will know that Nero, after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, he began building this massive house complex that took up a big chunk of Rome with its own private lake and things like that, called the Golden House. And he made significant progress before he died in 68. On Saturday, 2 days from now, I'm going to go visit the excavations of the Golden House underground, deep underground. A couple of rooms have been excavated and found, so that's exciting. Anyhow, he said, this disgrace of Nero's Golden House, we're just going to wipe it out, and the Colosseum, the famous, like the biggest tourist attraction in Rome, actually the Flavian amphitheater. It was built by Vespasian and Titus to commemorate their victory over the Judeans. Like there used to be a little inscription on the exits saying, this was built with the spoils of war. What war? The only war the Flavians were involved in was the war in Judea. So they were claiming, I think mischievously, not truthfully, that they built this massive 50,000 seat complex from the spoils of war in Jerusalem because they pretended that they had conquered a foreign people for the first time, which was, of course, not at all true. They simply scammed everybody. Anyhow, he also, Vespasian, could claim not only was he the man who had done all this great stuff in a foreign land, but he had a son, an heir, and a spare. His son Titus was actually the guy who brought down Jerusalem, and young Domitian, who was only 18 at the time, was still hanging around in Rome, but at least he was a spare of the same high quality blood, so he could take over. So yeah, so he was the guy to become emperor because he personally had achieved all this stuff, and he had a son who was just like him and had proven himself in battle, helping his father out there. So, in short, he was turning what was really a provincial, unrest in Jerusalem within a Roman province to a foreign war, as if he conquered a foreign people. So, Flavians agreed with the Senate to portray this suppression of disturbance in a long-standing province as if it were a foreign victory. So he claimed to be kind of like a new Augustus who had really conquered the East, the threat from the East, which was really just a problem in Jerusalem. And he was allowed to expand. In ancient Rome, they had a kind of sacred barrier around, not a barrier, but a marked line around the city called the Pomerium. And the idea was that when Rome added territory to the empire, they also expanded this Pomerium. It's just a line marked with stones, chippy, and this was allowed by the Senate, his enablers in the Senate, to expand the Pomerium as if he'd actually added territory to the empire.
Because that was like a goal of theirs, right? They all wanted to try and say, oh, we got the Gauls. Oh, we got these, the Germans. They're always trying to expand, but really this is more propaganda is what you're saying.
Precisely. And nobody really knew. I mean, what did the average person know? They didn't have a lot of history books. They didn't really care that much about Judea. So there was actually, in the Circus Maximus in Rome, there was actually an inscription, which I'll show you the text of in a moment, that said they had, Titus had done what no one else had ever done in conquering these ferocious Judeans. So, and then he built a Temple of Peace, which is just down, it's like a couple hundred meters from where I'm sitting right now. Near the Forum of Augustus, he built his own forum, Vespasian's forum, called the Forum of Peace. And that's where he displayed the goods from the Jerusalem temple. So the real concern in Rome was not with the Judeans. Nobody cared about the Judeans. They're far away, who's really heard of them? But their concern was with the destructive civil war. But what they needed was somebody who had the credibility, the status, the goods to suppress that. And that was Vespasian. And so he began a series of endless celebrations in Rome, new construction projects, built temples, erected arches, issued endless series of coins, not because Judea had been any kind of a threat to Rome, but because of his local needs. So he spun it in terms of his legitimacy, and he overwhelmed everybody with talking about how great a dude he was. So he created this new province. So that's how he spun it, right? He added a province to the empire by simply carving out what had been part of the province of Syria into a new province, Judea, with its own senatorial governor. And
Dr. Mason, yeah. I think this is an important thing that came to my mind, and I really, really think it's important to ask. I hope you feel it's not cutting off or even interrupting the flow of what you're doing here. But because so much unrest in Rome within themselves was going on, I tend to read Mark and the rest of the Gospels as post-war documents. Robin Faith Walsh has written that she thinks these are educated, not necessarily elites, but they are like wannabes. They're wanting to try and like be the best, even though they're not the best writers out there. And she says there's something, like you talk about, exotic to the Romans and those that aren't in this region about Jewish people. I wonder, it's a bit speculative, but it's not out of the question to get your thoughts. I wonder if there was so much hype being made about this Judean war from the propaganda of the Roman Empire from the top down, that these documents that we now call Gospels are kind of like this exotic propaganda in light of what's been going on with the unrest in Rome that gives curiosity to people that are not in the region to like really take an interest in this area and these people that they never really gave too much care for. So that helped, if anything, make it more popular than it ever would have been. What are your thoughts?
Interesting idea. I think there might be something to that. I think it's very little that there is to that. And so I'm being very blunt with you here, Derek. I know you just like honesty and you like an open exchange of ideas. So I haven't read Robin's studies. I have to say that right away. So I'm not interacting with what she's written. I haven't read them, and I don't know the bases. I've read a couple of reviews, and I have a kind of vague idea. But what's going on in my head as I think of what you're saying is, how would that explain the evidence, right? How would it explain what's in Mark, for example? How would it explain what's in Luke Acts? I do think, especially with Luke Acts, I do think there's something to that. Definitely the idea of the exotic. It's not just Judea, but this guy, wants to talk about the harbors of Malta and Crete and travel things and what it's like to travel and be shipwrecked. And he's naming governors and exotic situations that his audience won't have visited, right? So I do think, in general, yes. So let me give that right away. I think that's right. That most authors, including Josephus, wanted an element of the exotic in their writings. Yes. But do I think that that's and I'm not sure that Robin said this exactly, so I'm not sure what I'm responding to, but do I think that the Gospels in general had this as a primary motive? I just don't see how that would explain the detailed content of, say, especially Mark, for example. But that's a very quick response off the cuff.
Yeah, because not reading too much into it, I just wonder if Yeah, that's a whole different discussion, I think, for future, maybe a future endeavor as well. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
sure.
I'm sorry. Sorry,
That
took you off track. I
no,
just, in my
you
mind, I'm
didn't.
thinking, what would make these? I don't think Mark is just a nobody. I'm with Dennis. I think that these are educated, writers, and they know that they not only are trying to write about Jesus. I'm a bit convinced that there's awareness of other literature that they're reading, and that these aren't dummies. And so I kind of wonder if what's going on, kind of like with Luke Acts, you point this out, and I don't want to take us off your recording, but like in Luke Acts, it's exotic, but it also is tapping into things that I tend to think that this person is setting up Jesus as the better than Julio Claudio line. I mean, you just described the 4 emperors and like how chaotic. I can't imagine Jews weren't looking at this, or some educated authors. I don't know if Luke would be a Jew. It wouldn't matter. They're Hellenistic, and they're looking at what's going on in Rome and going, this eternal kingdom that was promised by Romulus and all these Caesars, it's not eternal. We have the real eternal king who's the Son of God, who's going to bring peace and all that, as almost like it kind of makes me wonder if this is like propaganda in some way, trying to co-opt the failures of what's taking place within the Roman seat of government and such. But anyway, I think there's a whole show. We could get into some of this stuff at some point in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that the author of Luke Acts is one smart cookie, and he drops all kinds of very learned allusions in his writing. He also writes very well. I mean, he's at the top level of his Greek syntax and, interesting vocabulary. He writes as a very sophisticated person. The author of Mark, not so much. I mean, the authors of Luke and Matthew both clearly didn't think Mark was all that, because he just says some very odd things, and he uses it in a very strange way. Like he throws in immediately everywhere
Yeah.
when it's not really sensible, and Matthew reworking Mark puts it in a better place. And there's just a lot of odd stuff in Mark, like cursing the fig tree and then saying, well, it wasn't the season for figs. But well, why did Jesus curse a fig tree that was not bearing figs, when the author turns around and says, and it wasn't anyway, it wasn't the season for figs? Or like when the woman comes and touches his clothes, and he jumps, looks around, who touched me? Like he feels power drained from him, but he doesn't know who stole power. This is all very it seems kind of naive, right? It seems kind of childish. And thing is that Matthew changes all this stuff when he reworks Mark. He cleans it up, so to speak. It's much more like the woman with the hemorrhage scene. He changes it so that Jesus doesn't appear to be lost. With the devil saying, "What do you mean? Why are you asking us who touched you? Can't you see all these people who touched you?" Like, it's very odd. I don't have such a high. I think Mark's fascinating, partly because it's a very kind of simple text in my view. But I could be wrong, and lots of people smarter than I am who have worked on it intensively.
I want it, just so you know, when I'm writing you and we're talking about topics, I promise you we can't run out of topics. I mean, you could literally say, we're going to do a live hangout, and you and me would have, I'm not exaggerating, so many questions. We would have to put a deadline on like when we cut off, because there's so much to discuss, even if we don't have the answers. It's a fun mental exercise to kind of take someone like you who knows certain things historically based on dark documentation or archaeological findings or whatever it might be, numismatic evidence, you name it. And then just kind of like to play around and say, hey, don't take us too serious. We're going to speculate some, and then we're going to also educate you on the reality of what we know. Or at least what literature says, and we can do that. Just keep that in mind. Please continue, though. I apologize for throwing you a curveball, and we'll have fun at Q&A.
Don't apologize. Yeah, we both have as a famous person once said, a particular set of skills. Yes.
Is this the one where he's on the phone? I have a particular set of skills where I'm
It
going to
is.
find
Yeah.
you
Yeah,
and hunt
exactly.
you down.
Okay, back to the desert fortresses. The point I simply want to make is that that war was over and Vespasian was done and celebrating and happy and drunk and all that without caring about the desert fortresses. So this idea that they were all part of the war already has to go. In So you can define a war any way you want, right? You could say the Korean War is still going because it has never ended, right? There's demilitarized zone and kind of a status quo. You could say the Korean War is still on, but most people would say it ended a long time ago in the 50s. So you could say, I mean, the Judean War. I think one of your contributors, I think I caught this right at the beginning, said the Jewish War is still going on, something like that. Yeah, okay. But as far as the Flavians were concerned, it was really over. It was over in 70, and that's what they were celebrating. And I just had a passage there from Josephus saying Vespasian wasn't interested. He left Herodium, Machaerus, and Masada out of the picture. He could finish up without them. He wasn't worried about them. But that's already an interesting and important fact, right, of the evidence. So here's the triumphal parade that takes place in June of 71, according to Josephus, who was present. He says the war furnished a vivid spectacle. They were celebrating, they had images of a prosperous countryside laid waste, entire enemy battalions being killed, some running away, others being taken captive, walls of enormous magnitude being demolished by Roman engines, fortresses being overrun, cities full of defensive manpower being overwhelmed, fire blazing in temples, plural, and all sorts of stuff like that. This was a complete fabrication. Josephus has described the war in 4 volumes by that point, and none of that's true. None of that happened. So the Flavians are making stuff up. They're making a big deal of what they achieved. So Vespasian proceeds to rebuild Rome by erecting a bunch of temples, rebuilds the temple of Jupiter, which has been destroyed in Rome at the same time as the Jerusalem temple, strangely enough, in the Civil War in Rome. The temple of Jupiter was destroyed. He rebuilds it. He builds other temples, arches, all kinds of stuff. There's where his forum is, right next to the Forum of Augustus. Well, then later, Nerva tried to stick another one in there. Domitian had tried to fit one in, and then he was assassinated, and Nerva took over and stuck a little forum in there to get in between Vespasian and Augustus. Everybody wants to be close to Augustus. And that's what remains of it today, just down the street from here. The Forum of Vespasian, where the Temple of Peace was, and the Colosseum I mentioned, was really the Flavian amphitheater. And here's that inscription I was talking about. It was Gezel Fuldi, who figured out from the peg holes that were holding up. So he found a lintel with all these lines of peg holes, and he simply experimented with different wording of how those could have supported. Is a little bit like Morse code, dot dash dit da dit, that kind of thing. How do you figure out what the letters are? And he figured it out that it actually said, the emperor Caesar, the title Vespasian, he ordered this new amphitheater built ex manubis, out from the spoils of war. Also then later the Arch of Titus that has survived, been rebuilt, been renovated by Pope Pius VII. That stands what we call the Arch of Titus today. Then Arch of Titus in the Circus Maximus that I mentioned that bore this inscription, and all kinds of other monuments partly we know this from a funerary relief of the Hateri family tomb in Rome on one of the exit streets, highways of Rome. And it's honoring, well, a woman of the family died, but the family is all kind of anchored by this guy, Haterius. And he was apparently involved somehow in the building, because there are other bits of the tomb that have like engineering equipment in it. And he was apparently involved in these Flavian building projects. But you notice, so in the tomb, there are 5 of these Flavian constructions there. So what's common in all of them is this victory theme, martial victory. So you have in one archway, Mars, the god of war, victory on 2 sides, and then virtue, the goddess virtue, stepping on the helmet of an enemy, right? So clearly celebrating victory. And if you look at the left side image, way up at the top there, you see prisoners under palm trees with their hands tied behind their back. Well, these bound prisoners are clearly the Jews, the Judeans.
Hold on, Dr. Mason, just to make sure we're on the same page. The image that has, okay, hold on. So I see Arch of Titus right now. So, okay, we're at victory over whom, image-wise.
Yeah.
Is on this one where, okay, so this is the thing. In just recently, your images have delayed quite, like they're really, really delayed. So the one I'm looking at right now is victory over whom, right? That we're seeing Arch at. But there was 2 more that just kind of flashed by us just a moment. Like it's almost like you were giving commentary, but it wasn't. I saw the panel that had like 5 different arches, or at least burial looking arches, it looked like. But then it like skipped to another one. If you can go back 1 or 2, just.
Yeah, I've done that. It may take a moment to catch up.
Okay, so we're here. I see the long kind of stretched out one, monuments, temples, arches. We saw this one.
Yeah. So okay, my point is this is from this tomb, right? So this builder from the Flavian period built these 5 monuments, or was involved in the building of the 5 monuments. Now, one of them, the second one, you can see is the Colosseum, the Flavian amphitheater.
Right.
You can see from the archways and the way it's structured. One of them is a temple of Jupiter on the far right. The other 3 are not so clearly identified today. There's disputes about, which monument it is. But the one on the left, you can see it's an arch, something at Isis. It's grammatical. So it's at something of Isis. Whoever made this, it didn't write it grammatically, but it's an arch having to do with the temple of Isis.
Got it.
And that's known from Josephus as well, that the Flavians spent the night before the triumph at the temple of Isis for some reason. And it seems that, it's all to do with their Eastern conquest theme, right? Isis being an Egyptian goddess. And so they're trying to say, they've really incorporated, like Augustus did, into Rome. But it's all kind of a sham and a scam. But yeah, that's what they did.
Okay.
So are you with me? So
yes, far? Yes, sir.
So all of these are, the point is, saturated with motifs of victory in the East, right? That's what they all have. So on the second one, like the Colosseum there, you see a triumphal quadriga, the horses leading a chariot over the entranceway.
Are you at a new image now?
No, I'm still at the monuments, temples, arches.
Okay, got it.
So there's a second image there. I don't know if you can make it out, but there are horses. There are 4 horses sitting up over the entranceway. Okay. That's a triumphal quadriga, a 4-horse chariot, right? Can you see the horses there?
I think, is it on the left side? Because I see 6 windows. Okay. Yeah. It's hard to make out, but yes.
On the left side, there are horses there. Yeah. And they're pulling a chariot. And this is a sign of triumph as well, right? So the simple point, we don't need all the details here, but the simple point is all of these images celebrate victory, military victory, right? So I was with the next image, which should be up in a second. I've
Yes, I
advanced
see
to
it.
Yeah, and so you see here, this is an arch in the Via Sacra Summa. It says along the top, the Via Sacra. Some people think it's the Arch of Titus, the original Arch of Titus. That's not clear at all. But anyway, whatever it is, it's an arch that's celebrating victory, right? So the god of war, Mars, on the left, the goddess Victoria on the right, the goddess of victory, and then the goddess of masculine virtue, Virtus, with her foot raised on an enemy helmet
Okay.
in the center, right? So, and then that image on the far left, if you look up at the top, you can see, I think you can clearly see, I can, prisoners bound under palm trees. Can you see
Okay.
that?
Up at the very top left.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
you
kind
see
of
that
hard to see. Yeah, but
kneeling prisoners with a
okay.
palm tree. Can you see the palm tree in the?
Somewhat. It's hard to make out if I'm honest, but it's like I'm following your arrow and I see what you're saying right there.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's clear if you can see it in a good photograph. It's very clear. And
Okay.
you have on the right side what's called a trophy, which in Roman terms is a set of armor. Right? That's a tropium. It's a set of armor showing military victory, and the prisoners are kneeling with their hands bound, right? And then you can see the frontward looking, you may not be able to see this very clearly, horses, again, 4 horses of a
Mm,
quadriga. And on the left side of them, more prisoners with hands bound and a palm tree in between them. So anyway, the point is, whether you can see it all clearly or not, that the Flavians were endlessly celebrating their victory in the East. And here's the famous Arch of Titus, reconstructed by the Pope in the early 19th century. The old part is original in the center. The center part is original. It's old in the center there. You can see how old it is, right? And the rest of it was reconstructed by this Pope. But what it says, the inscription is clear and it's ancient, it's original. The Senate and the people of Rome, for the deified, that is, he's dead and become a god, Titus Vespasianus, son of Vespasianus Augustus, that is, Titus, the son of Vespasian. They both had the same name. So
yeah.
Titus Flavius Vespasianus was the name of both of them, but one was known by his first name and one was known by his last name. So Titus is pictured as joining the gods, but famously inside, what is the Senate and Domitian later choose to emphasize? The spoils from the temple in Jerusalem. That's his lifelong claim to fame. In other words, that he destroyed the temple. And so he's not embarrassed about it at all. He's very happy about it, that he, destroyed this center of alleged rebellion against Rome. On the other side is Titus with the goddess holding a wreath over his head and maybe whispering in his ear, but attending the triumphal celebration. And if you look on this image of a piece of armor, cuirass, found across the Mediterranean in modern Libya, at a town called Sabrata, you see there from a statue of Vespasian. The imagery on the front is, again, of victory, riding on a shield, right? Winged victory there on the left, riding on a shield about Rome's victory. You clearly see, I think, the palm tree, right, with the bound prisoners, Eastern prisoners dressed like Easterners, sitting around, right, in a state of dismay. You see
Yeah.
the image
Oh
there?
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and that's so. This is all they talk about. The Flavians is their victory in Judea. That's my point. And then here's the business from that lost arch in the Circus Maximus for Titus, who, by his own precepts and the good counsel of his father, subdued the nation of the Judeans and destroyed the city of Jerusalem, which all the leaders and kings of other races before him had either attacked in futility, either they attacked it and didn't get anywhere, or they just didn't even try. He was the first one to capture Jerusalem. This is, of course, utter nonsense, but it was inscribed. And then they issued all these coins. Sorry, I'm going too fast, probably.
No,
But
no.
all these coins featuring from gold coins, very precious gold coins, all the way down to little bronze coins, celebrating their victories. Peace, finally, victory. There's victory writing on the shield. Vitellius had already tried to get in on Vespasian's success in the East. Vitellius is trying, because he's emperor, he's trying to horn in on Vespasian's success in the East because he's his general in theory. And there's the triumphal procession. And you can see the prisoner at the front of the procession, which is probably Simon Bar Giora, pictured on the coin. Judea, looking, weeping under a trophy, a Roman set of armor, right, and clearly marked as Judea. So the Flavians just kept issuing these coins and celebrations and arches. They couldn't stop talking about how they'd beaten the Jews. So the point is, the war was essentially the siege of Jerusalem for them. That's the main part of the war. That's what they celebrated. It was crucial for their credentials, and they weren't embarrassed in the slightest about having destroyed the temple. It proved them to be tough, capable, dealing with a foreign menace, and they stabilized Roman governance for a long time to come. They actually did. So there was no more year of the four emperors. Vespasian ruled for a long time, 9-10 years. Titus died, unfortunately, young, after just 2.5, 3 years. And then Domitian, pardon me, from 81 to 96. But that set in train a much more stable period of Roman governance through the 2nd century, which is often considered the kind of highlight of Roman stability, the Antonine period. And even Trajan, who took over from 98 to 117, a long ruling, it's 20 years as emperor, he was the son, he'd been in Judea because he was the son of the very successful commander of the 10th Legion, Fretensis, which had fought in Judea. So his father, Trajan dad, had been the commander of the 10th Legion in Judea. And that legion became the provincial legion of the new province of Judea after 70. But Daddy Trajan was no longer the commander of it. So finally, we come to the desert fortresses. As tends to happen, I've lingered too long on the introduction, but I'll try to move along swiftly here, because there are just a very few points, and with some visual help, as long as the slides come through in time, please tell me if they don't.
I will.
I can make the main points I want to make here. So here's a typical scholarly view. Now, this scholar, brilliant scholar, a Roman strategist, or he's an expert in military strategy, not an expert in Roman Judea. But I quote him because he reflected a very common view. The war had essentially been won, only Masada was still holding out. But this spark of resistance might rekindle at any time the fire of revolt. The Romans launched a 3-year operation to take Masada. And the very insignificance of the objective, that is, Masada by itself, didn't really matter that much. But it must have impressed everybody, he says, because he's trying to make a point about how the Romans demonstrated to everyone that they would never let go. They would, push their enemies right to the very end of destruction. And he uses Masada as an example of that. So but he's taking over a very common idea that Jerusalem was destroyed, and then the survivors of Jerusalem fled to Masada, and that was their last holdout. And you see this in another book by Moshe Perlman, the Zealots of Masada, as he calls them. So Titus slaughtered thousands of Jewish prisoners in the fall of Jerusalem, and he took the rest as captives to Rome. But not all. A few managed to escape. They were determined to continue the fight. They were led by Eleazar ben Yair, and they were called Zealots. They made their painful way eastward from Jerusalem to the Judean desert. And then all through the rest of the next few years, they continued to occupy Masada and harry, that is, harass the Roman authorities whenever they could, as well as disrupting Roman rule. The Romans paid little attention to them at first, but then as their raids continued, they couldn't help but take notice. What annoyed the Romans even more than their losses was the harm to their prestige, so they finally took out Masada. Now, the problem with this common view is that it's not true, or at least by which I mean it doesn't have any foundation in the evidence. It doesn't fit with anything that is known about what happened if you pay attention to the sources. And at the end of the day, that's what historians have to do, right? Is explain the evidence. So some of these, most of the popular views and some common academic views have really doubtful foundations. History is an open investigation, and there are very basic questions that are ignored in this kind of approach. So, for example, what kind of places were the desert fortresses? What were they built for? What were they useful for? What could you do in one of these places if you got there? Could you fight Romans from Masada? Well, it's pretty difficult because you're out in the middle of nowhere. So why would you go to Masada? Why did the Judeans occupy Machaerus and Masada? What were they hoping for? And when the Romans did come finally and take them, why? Why did they wait so long after the fall of Jerusalem? It was not a continuous war. And what happened in their final capture in each case? So the main evidence that we have that needs explaining is Josephus's account, which is in the 7th volume of his war, and the archaeology, which is very considerable now. The main excavations of Masada were done in the early 60s, 63 to 65, in a very big, famous excavation led by Yigal Yadin. But there have been many smaller subsequent excavations of various relevant parts, the camps, the ramp, the palaces on the top, and so on. As for Machaerus, it's much more recent and doesn't get anywhere near the same press, I think because it's in Jordan and not part of the national story in Israel. But it's being excavated still by a Hungarian scholar named Gilzo Vurush, and I'm not sure I'm saying his name correctly. Pardon me if you happen to know Hungarian. That's probably not the right pronunciation, but it's Vuros, and 2 O's have umlauts, 2 dots over them. So I would guess Vurush. I've corresponded with Gilzo quite a bit, but I've never met him in person. So anyway, he's excavating with the authority of the Jordanian Antiquities authorities. Part of the reason, by the way, is they want to have that open because that's the place where, according to Josephus, John the Baptist was executed at Machaerus. You wouldn't know that from the Gospels, which don't mention Machaerus, but Josephus claims that John the Baptist was executed there. And taking that as a fact, the Jordanian authorities want to open it as a site of pilgrimage for what they perceive to be the 2000th anniversary of John the Baptist's execution in 2030. So that's part of what the excavation is being done for, to get it
just
ready
a brief
for.
comment from you, Steve.
Yeah.
And you could just say yes or no if you want to save time. Are you persuaded by any of the arguments that Josephus made up the John the Baptist statement?
No.
Okay. Just Simple as that. Cool.
Yeah. I have a book coming out now. It's it's in press, and there's a chapter on John the Baptist if anybody's interested in that. And I deal with various arguments about the historicity of John and so on.
Or interpolation or anything like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So when we talk about the desert fortresses, here's what we're talking about. So about 7 or 8 of these, and you notice where they are. So they're all around the frontiers of areas. So from the hill country where it meets the plain in 2 or 3 cases, and then the cursor doesn't work in this mode, so I can't point as I'm inclined to do. But the ones that we're most interested in here are the bottom 3, right? Herodium, south of Jerusalem, near Bethlehem. Machaerus is over in Jordan, and Masada. And we'll look a little more closely at each of these. So we'll focus on these last 3 because these are the 3 that we saw Vespasian left, right, untouched. The other 4 were mostly wrapped up after the Hasmonean period. They were no longer very significant, but the last 3 were left in Judea. Now, what's the purpose of them? We can get right to the point here. They're not for fighting. They're not for perimeter defense. They're not for controlling the roads. What do I mean by that? Well, just as I said before, when you see a picture of where Machaerus is, you realize you're not fighting anybody from there. Someone would have to really go out of his way to want to fight with you in Machaerus. And it's not for perimeter defense because it's just one little blob, like one little site, right? And there are no roads to control that you can control from these places. They're not military bases. They're not barracks. They're not filled with, military stuff. They are rather given to royal comforts. There's palaces, baths, cold, hot, medium baths, very fancy facilities, especially at Masada, and storehouses, massive storehouses, as much storehouses as you can, as much storage as you can create on the site is there, right? They are easy to reach in the sense they're far away. They're as far away as you can get from Jerusalem. These ones that we're talking about, Machaerus and Masada, on the frontiers of the Nabatean kingdom. So they're as far away as you can get from Jerusalem, but they're easy to reach in the sense that it's not difficult. It just takes a little time to get to them. But once you're there, it's also easy to defend them because they only have one access route. So if you can take that access route, which is pretty easy to get up on the top, then you can close off the rest because there are steep drops on the other sides, right? So as long as you control that one access route to get up on the hill, you're golden. Now, what they're for, clearly, is to get away, to not to fight, but the opposite, to go and hide. They're places of refuge. They are to escape from assassins, urban mob violence, or in the case of King Herod, Cleopatra's, Antony and Cleopatra, she at one point got very angry with Herod and tried to send agents to kill him. And he, one of the things he liked about these fortresses was he could go hide there if necessary. So they are at the farthest possible distance from the major cities in extremely remote places. And therefore, this safekeeping of royal personages, their valuables, their families, especially their women and children. Herod was the main builder of these 3 because he had the biggest need. He had a lot of enemies. Josephus remarks in an offhand remark in Book 4 of the War, when he's introducing Masada or reintroducing, he says, a very strong fortress was not far from Jerusalem, fitted out by our ancient kings as a repository for their stuff and for the security of their persons in the turmoil of war. It's a place they could get away to. And his narrative offers several examples of how these fortresses were used. So back in 75 BC, Queen Alexandra Salome allowed the friends of her late husband, Alexander Jannaeus, who were enemies of the Pharisees, and the Pharisees were trying to purge. So Alexander Onias had killed a bunch of Pharisees, and when he died and the Pharisees received some power under his widow, they in turn purged the people who had been killing them. And according to Josephus, she, the widow, allowed them, because she was still friends with some of them, they were respected people, to go and use these fortresses to hide in. But she didn't allow them to go to Machaerus, Hyrcania, Alexandria, because that's where the royal treasures were located, and she didn't want them messing around with the royal treasures. So this tells us that these were safe deposit places, right? She said, you can go to Masada, that's okay. We don't have any royal treasures there. But that's already interesting that these places were considered the most secure. So Hyrcania and Alexandria further up the Jordan Valley, and Machaerus was the strongest of the fortress sites in her view. Then, when Pompey came along and conquered Judea, he ordered the fortresses destroyed while he was, shrinking the Hasmonean territory. He basically said, well, we either have to garrison these with our own soldiers because they are natural fortresses and keep them as our protection places, or we put them beyond use for others to go and take refuge in. And we don't have the soldiers yet to garrison them, so I want them destroyed. Well, he didn't destroy them. And a few years later, Alexander, the son of Aristobulus II, who's a Hasmonean who doesn't like the Roman arrival, he uses these fortresses as a refuge, not as fighting posts, but a place for him to hide securely while he is going out and resisting Rome. And so Gabinius, a Roman governor, orders them destroyed. Then in 39, 38 BC, when King Herod needs to go and fight the Parthians to take control of Jerusalem because he's been made king by the Romans, but the Parthians are still there, he has to go and fight them. He deposits his women folk, that is his mother-in-law, wives, at Masada as he goes to fight the Parthians. So these are not fighting fortresses or forward operating bases or something like that. They are places of secure refuge, relative comfort, spacious palatial buildings, and they're far from the turmoil of Jerusalem. So Machiavelli said that the reason that monarchs need fortresses is when they have assassins coming for them. That's the main reason to use them. And that's exactly the function of these fortresses. It's to get away from the turmoil in Jerusalem. So if you're in Jerusalem with, all the urban crowds, it's relatively easy for an assassin to take you out, right? But if you're sitting on this very remote hilltop, it's not so easy. Now, how did these come to play a role in the war? Well, this is the crucial part. Josephus narrates that it was already in 66 CE, right? This at the very beginning of disturbances in Jerusalem, where you have different Jewish groups fighting each other, killing each other, before Vespasian has arrived. And Cestius Gallus is mostly nowhere to be seen. He just made that expedition in October. But aside from that, it's Jewish groups fighting with each other. So the group under Eleazar ben Hananiah, and the group under Menachem are fighting with each other. And they both armed themselves for saying who should be in control of our situation here. So Josephus says that some of those who were most motivated for war got together and charged against the fortress that is called Masada. After seizing it by stealth, they killed the Roman, probably auxiliary sentries that were stationed there and installed guards of their own. And a little bit later on in the same volume of War, he says, the massive Judeans at Machaerus. So there were Judeans living at Machaerus who, he says, persuaded the Roman garrison or auxiliary garrison who guarded the place to abandon it and hand it over to themselves. The soldiers, being worried that they would be killed, said, okay, we'll go if you make a pledge of security for us. And when they'd received the necessary pledges, they handed over the fortress. And so now the Judean people of Machaerus held the fortress with their own guard. Then he says that because King Herod had stored arms for his bodyguard and plenty of food there way back 100 years earlier, or no, 80 years earlier, he says that one of the rebel groups in Jerusalem, Menachem's group, Menachem took his acquaintances and withdrew to Masada. Thereafter, he broke open the armory of King Herod and fully armed the bandits, as Josephus calls them, of his group, as well as the commoners, taking all these spear bearers. He returned to Jerusalem quite like a king. So this is Josephus' mockery. But the point is, he's saying he liberated all this weaponry from what Herod had stored there for the use of his bodyguard, right, of 800 guys to use at Masada. So this is professional grade, equipment, swords, spears, shields, things like that. And they bring them back to Jerusalem and use them in the civil strife against each other. And this guy Menachem, took over the siege of the Roman auxiliary garrison from Eleazar, son of Ananias. Then Eleazar, son of Ananias group, took on Menachem's group, and they all picked up stones and threw them, and Menachem's group held out for a while, but then they saw the whole populace had joined Eleazar and rushed against them. They all took off. A few came through safely to Masada. They were led by Eleazar, son of Yair, and he was related to Menachem by ancestry, who later became, in Josephus' language, the tyrant of Masada. Now, the point is, this was all in 66. So this idea that we read at the beginning from Moshe Perlman, that there was the war until the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, and then the few survivors of the destruction of Jerusalem fled to Masada, that's just nowhere in the evidence at all. Josephus claims that the people who went to Masada were fleeing the civil strife in Jerusalem among different Jewish groups, right? Menachem's group got creamed by Eleazar's group. And a few survivors, not Menachem, he was killed, but one of his relatives named Eleazar ben Yair led a group off to Masada. And archaeology now confirms that at this point, from 66 onward, the royal buildings, the large palatial buildings on Masada built for Herod, were now subdivided and supplemented by external structures built around them, is much smaller, to house a bunch of refugees from Jerusalem. And I'll show you why we know the dates in a second, but this is from 66. Now, I'm going to skip over this. That's about Herodium. I think we're going to run out of time otherwise. But I just want to quickly mention who are the Sicarii. And I don't know if I can do this quickly, but I'm going to try very quickly. There's a common idea in scholarship, and many of your viewers will have seen this, that the Sicarii were some kind of political faction, anti-Roman, that kind of thing. Again, it doesn't fit the evidence. Josephus says this when he introduces this term Sicarii. This is what he says. Back in the 50s, when Felix is the governor, the procurator, sub-governor of Judea, he says, after he'd cleaned up the countryside of bandits and things like that, a different species of bandit was creeping up in Jerusalem called Sicarii. Who were these people? Well, they would murder people in the broad daylight, in the middle of the city. How did they do that? Well, because they mingled with the mob carrying small daggers under their clothes, the sika, right, a Roman sika. And with these, they would stab their enemies. And then those who had committed the murders would stand there and look and say, oh, look, that guy just fell down. What happened to him? And they'd join the others in showing indignation, so they went completely undiscovered. And he says that Jonathan, the high priest, was killed by them. He had enemies who just walked up to him in a crowd, stabbed him, put their knife under their cloak and said, oh gosh, what's happened to Jonathan? And then after him, many others were done away with. more difficult than the calamities was the fear of them. This generated, as always does, we know, in modern times, there's an incident with guns or whatever, and then everybody's terrified.
Or a serial killer murders like 4
Exactly.
people. Next thing you know, the
Yeah.
whole nation thinks their neighbor's a serial killer. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's what he's saying here with great, I think, psychological insight. So each person was expecting death every hour, just as in war. And the crucial thing here is they would scrutinize their foes from a distance, like they kept social distancing of like 30 meters. And there was no trust even among approaching friends, because they think, does this person really like me or not? Or, I don't know, don't get too close. Even with all their suspicions, they would be done away with. So even though people were protecting themselves, everyone's carrying at this point in the 50s a blade under their cloak. So that's what he means by Sicarii. It's not a political faction. What he's saying is there was an outbreak of Islam where people get the idea, copycat stuff. They all started packing, knives under their cloaks so they could very easily get rid of the people they didn't like. And this was a real plague on the city. That's who the Sicarii were. We only know about Sicarii from Josephus. That's it. And this is a Latin term transliterated into Greek. It's not a Greek word, it's a Latin word. There are rabbinic references that have sometimes been linked to the Sicarii in Hebrew and Aramaic, but they're not very clear. It's not clear at all that they're talking about Sicarii. For example, there's a guy named Abba Sikra. Well, is that just a coincidence that it sounds kind of a little bit like? There's nothing clear about this, and anyway, that's 6th century, 500 years later, in a rabbinic text. So the only clear evidence we have of Sicarii comes from Josephus and the Book of Acts, in one place where the tribune says to Paul, "Are you the Egyptian who led the Sicarii?" It's a very confused reference as well, and I've argued, as you know, Derek, that this comes actually from Josephus, from Acts. Misremembered Josephus. Anyhow, Josephus is the one who talks about Sicarii. He's writing in Rome, and I think it's very clear. I think it's clear that the reason he uses Sicarii so often is it's a scare word in Rome. There was a law of Sulla from 81 BCE to prosecute people who were Sicarii or poisoners, veneficii, because these are the 2 crimes that are insidious, right? They're the 2 crimes that you can use to get rid of political opponents and walk away. You can poison them, which is very common in Rome, or you can bribe a chambermaid or chamber attendant to go and stab them and then just walk away. Or you can do it in a crowded place. That's the ideal situation for a Sicarius. So the Sicarii are not a political party in Judea, and they play no role in the war against Rome. Once these people take off to Masada, there are no more Sicarii mentioned in the war. So this idea of the Sicarii as anti-Roman fighters just has no evidence to it. It has to do with a rash of concealed knife crime against fellow Judeans, Josephus emphasizes, right? In the 50s and early 60s. Sicarii do not appear in the heart of the war, in War 3 to 6. In all the narrative of the war, they don't engage in conflict with Rome. And then Antiquity is slightly different, but still doesn't put them in conflict with Rome. So we can skip over with that. Now, at Masada, Josephus says that what's going on at Masada in 67, 68, 69, all these years, while Vespasian is encroaching into Judea and puts his campaign on hold for 2 years, what's going on over at Masada? Well, he says, those called Sicarii, those he calls Sicarii, were based at Masada, were overrunning the neighboring territories, not fighting Romans. They were raiding Jewish villages, procuring for themselves nothing more than was necessary. Remember, Masada is just a desert outpost, so they've got families, children there. So they need food, right? They need fresh food. So they go and raid the villages around to grab fresh food for them. But that's all they did at first. Anxiety prevented them from any greater plunder. They just raided the most local villages. When they learned, however, that the Roman army was idle once Nero had died and Vespasian put his campaign on hold, and their Judean enemies in Jerusalem were riven by civil strife and tyranny of different guys being tyrants, they just decided they could be a little bit bolder. And so they raided the town of Engedi. Now, Engedi is a famous, world famous oasis town, Jewish town, that it was famous for its date palms. So dates from Engedi were like super valued. And because it was an oasis, even though it's got desert all around it, it could, produce nice vegetables and things like that. It was really well watered. So the people of Masada decided they could extend their raids a little bit further and go for the real good stuff from Engedi. And they went to Engedi. According to Josephus, they killed more than 700 people there, women and children. Now, that's according to Josephus. He always inflates numbers. Maybe it was 70, maybe 7, who knows. But anyway, it was nasty. That they raided the town, grabbed the very best of the produce, and brought it back up to Masada. Indeed, they plundered all the villages around the fortress, devastated the entire countryside. And other men came to join them because of all the good stuff that they were able to grab. So they were kind of, from a Roman point of view, they were a pirate community or a bandit community, a bandit nest in Roman terms, latrones in Latin. That is, living outside the law, right? A law unto themselves, raiding nearby towns. In a way, you can understand why, because again, they had no fresh food and they had families there.
And just for our audience to see a picture, this is a date palm, and those are little fruits, and what they almost come out like raisin type fruits. And you're like, I was out here. We'll get into some of this when you're done with the presentation, Steve, to show a few videos of me on Masada that I thought were really cool, to kind of add to your point of how interesting this is. But these are like, if you're in the middle of nowhere in the desert, this is like gold. I mean, this is just heaven in the middle of nowhere fruit. Anyway, just to give people an idea.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Now, we know a little bit about comings and goings at Masada, not only from Josephus' narrative, but also from the coins that have been discovered at Masada. So, these coins that were minted in Jerusalem during the war, they're often called revolt coins. I'm not sure that they were revolting in any particular way. They needed coins, and they're beautiful silver coins that were minted in Jerusalem, numbered years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So they were produced from 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, and then they stopped. Now, what's interesting is, of the coins that have been found at Masada, minted in Jerusalem, of the year 1 coins, that is 66 to 67, only 10 silver shekels and half shekels. This is from the original scattered group that went there in 66. The big year for coins is the year 2 coins. All of a sudden, you have 38 silver and well over 1,000, getting on for 2,000 bronze small coins from this period during the conflict with Rome. So this is the largest influx from Jerusalem, presumably, because obviously they couldn't have coins from a later period. So if they have coins from year 2, we can estimate that's when many of them arrive. They may have come also in year 3 with coins from year 2, that's possible. But then in year 3, the coins drop off significantly, 15 silver and under 500. Still some people coming. So this is in the period 67 to 69. We have clear evidence of new arrivals. Obviously, these could not be people who arrived in 66 if they're carrying coins from 67, 68, 69, right? So there were comings and goings to Masada, once people realized it was a safe place of refuge, and things in Jerusalem are really hotting up, as the English say, heating up, Americans say, during this period. So people could still get away from Jerusalem and off into the desert with their families, right? And then the coins really drop off, because from 69 onward, it was no longer really easy to leave Jerusalem. According to Josephus, the two main rebel leaders now, John of Giscala and Simon, had really kept people boxed in the city for various reasons we can't get into now. And then in year 5, there's really only 3 silver coins. So there's very little movement toward Masada now. So this confirms that it's been a place of refuge since 66, since Menachem's group, in the person of Eleazar, established a little community there. As it happens, we have a bill of divorce, a document dated to year 6 in Masada, or of Masada. That would be 71, 72. And this is so you have a husband and wife who were at Masada and decided they had enough of each other, living so closely together in the desert. Maybe not so surprising, perhaps. So a bill of divorce from the community there. But there are families living there, that's very clear. And this Miriam later went to Wadi Muraba'at, which is where the bill of divorce was found, not on Masada. What about those who didn't leave? Well, stands to reason that they would be the least mobile people, right? Those with families, especially, they couldn't just up and leave. And in Josephus's, for those of you who know Josephus' account of the end of Masada, you will know that the story depends on the idea that every man, or virtually every man, had many dependents, women and children, right? So it is a place of families, and archaeology more than confirms that. So, for example, you have 230 cooking and baking installations that have been found all around the summit. And those range from these kind of squared off stoves where you're cooking over open fires to these this tanur style oven where you bake bread by putting the dough on the side and heat it up that way. So these kind of ovens, and this is why I'm mentioning that's usually considered women's work. And you've got a bunch of bronze cooking pots and vessels. All these ceramic bowls, 265, have been found. Personal dishes, family dining. And then, especially indicative of women's presence, is all of these spindle whorls. That is, these little, I'm no expert in spinning and weaving, but these are used in manufacturing garments and things like that. And all of these things, these stone, bone, and ceramic and glass spindle whorls used in making clothing have been found there. Also, loom weights and other spinning devices for manufacturing. And some examples like weaving. These are from local, these have been identified as palm fronds from the area nearby. And in case that weren't evidence enough, you actually have cosmetic kits, and combs and brooches and things like that, parts of cosmetic stuff, and actual examples of plaited women's hair. Also, textile fragments, tons of them, 2,000 have been found or so. About only 120 odd have been published. That is, we've got images of them, but these are made of possibly local stuff and may therefore have been produced at Masada. Mostly wool, some linen, that is from a flax plant, and some goat hair, possibly local stuff. So it's clear that families are there taking refuge there. And even with Simon Bar Giora, this guy who became a tyrant in Jerusalem, Josephus has a story that when he was at odds with the Jerusalem leadership, he fled to Masada with his family. He took his womenfolk as a place of refuge there. He came to join those bandits who'd taken over Masada. That's Josephus's language again. They regarded him with suspicion at first and kept him together with the women he had brought along with him in the lower fortress only. What does that mean? Either way down below at the ground, or as you'll see in the coming picture, there are really two levels. There's a lower part of the upper summit, and then the upper part. You will have seen this, Derek, when you were there, that in the northwest, it rises up significantly.
Right. Over there on the side where Herod's palace would have been. Yeah,
that's the upper, that's the higher part, right?
Okay.
So it looks like maybe they said, okay, you can stay down far away in the lower
Let
part.
me give this. Does this help any? I don't know if you can see this, but the side on the furthest point in front of you is the northern spot, I believe. That's higher.
Yeah, I can't see it, but I'm betting you're right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the northern part is higher. That's right.
Right.
Clearly. Yeah. And so he's saying here that Simon joined them for a long time and started to participate in their raids around the place. But then he got kind of disgusted with them, saying they lacked, spirit, and he eventually left them. So here is a quick, now this will be really quick visual immersion of the sites. Here's Herodium. This is Herod's, named after himself. He built it from a natural hill. There was a little rise, and then he built it up into this kind of man-made volcano-looking thing, and then built this cylindrical tower within it, right? Actually, an amazing architectural achievement. This is a reconstruction of it. So that's what it would have looked like finished. And then he built a little theater for himself on the side of the hill, and eventually his mausoleum, which has been generally thought to have been discovered by Ehud Netzer shortly before he unfortunately passed away, a little more than I think a decade ago, something like that. Anyhow, this was Herod's construction or a reconstruction of it. And there was a city down below with swimming pools and all of that, or a town down below, but the fortress was on the top. There's an aerial view of the inside of what remains. There are tunnels and also rooms inside, cisterns and things like that. Shot of the inside where the towers are, and there's from the ground looking up. And that's a mock-up of what it would have looked like when it was in operation. So this was the desert fortress nearest to Jerusalem, not that far away. Machaerus. Completely different story. So here's the Dead Sea. On the west side, you have a kind of flatter shoreline. On the east side, over in Jordan, you have steep cliffs, right? Immediately, almost, on the east side. And they rise up like this. So if you're looking north, if you're looking east, then across the Dead Sea, that's where Machaerus is. But you can see from the location, right? This is what I meant. But if you flee there, you're not going there to fight anybody. You're going there to get away. So here's the terrain all around it. It's 7 kilometers inland from the Dead Sea. That's where it is, sitting up on this hill. You can see why Herod chose it, or the Hasmoneans chose it, and he embellished the place. It was a good place, to be really, really, really remote and to have a commanding view all around you. So it's about 700 meters above sea level, but because the Dead Sea is way below sea level, 400 meters below sea level, it's way, way, way above the Dead Sea and way above the surrounding valleys. Now, the main town was built on the side of the hill. This is what Josephus was talking about when he said the residents of Machaerus persuaded the garrison that had been stationed on top after the time of Herod to leave it, basically forced them out. And they said, okay, if you'll guarantee our safety. So a walled town was on the side, sort of like at Gamla, on a steep hill. And then the fortress was up at the top. And you can compare Gamla, right? That's where we know there was a town built on the steep side of the hill. Now, the remains today are where there used to be an aqueduct coming in to support the town from a higher hill to the southeast. It was crushed, and the Romans built two ramps when they came to take the place. So this is how it looks up on the top, but you can see that it's a palatial place. Like it's got all this bath complex, it's got this palace area, right? It's about the size of a football field, a little bit smaller, and it's largely devoted to storehouses, baths, palatial stuff, and protection, towers and gates. That's what it's all about, to protect the people living there. Right? It's not a place to fight from. It's not a military barracks. Right? And here's when you're up on the summit, looking out to the Dead Sea. Okay, so and that's a reconstruction by Vurus, the guy was talking about, of what it would have looked like. But it's basically a very comfortable place in the middle of nowhere. Now Masada, you can see in this shot from Todd Boland that it's actually part of a long escarpment, but the flow of the winter torrents, right, from the west have over time chiseled away a gap and created this kind of lozenge shaped thing, this rock, and it's created this kind of mesa. The torrents go around the two sides, and this ridge was created by the flowing of the torrents. That's what it looks like from the ground and then from the air. So it's inaccessible, really, except by this western ridge, which doesn't take you right to the summit, but it gets you most of the way there. And so that's how people generally got up. On the other side, on the east side, there are sheer drops, right, all the way around, but there is the famous snake path up the east side. It's tricky, and especially if somebody's on the summit who doesn't like you and is watching you come up, you're sitting duck, right? If you're on the snake path, you're really exposed. So you can see around in all directions. It's not as high. It's not as a tricky place as Masada. It rises up more than Machaerus. Masada rises up more than Machaerus does, above the plain around it, because you could see it. Machaerus, it's much hillier, right, all around. It's much more uneven surface. So Machaerus is actually the more difficult site, and that's why the Hasmoneans thought it the most secure, right? To get way out there in the middle of nowhere is really more difficult. Here, you could come down the coastal road, down the Dead Sea, and be at Masada. Now, you have your hard time getting up there, up to the top, but if you could get around to the west and go up the ramp, up the natural ramp, you could get most of the way there. And the plateau is about 10 times the surface of Machaerus, so there's lots more room to do stuff up there. As you can see, much of it, again, given over to abundant storerooms. There are a dozen hewn cisterns that Herod had cut out to make sure there was an adequate water supply, fed by two aqueducts from the winter torrents. So when the winter torrents came, you could stock up on the water. And he placed the cisterns in the place that was least susceptible to evaporation, right? So in the side of the hill where the water could be conveyed up to the top to cisterns as needed from the more secure cisterns on the side of the hill. And then up on the top, this is what I meant about there being lower and upper zones, right? When you're up on the top, there's actually quite a noticeable rise up to the top. So all the way around, you have, as you will have seen, Derek, all these so-called casemate apartments that Herod had built. These are, double-walled apartments all the way around the perimeter, which originally would have been for his bodyguard, right? There's, I think, about 1,300 meters or something like that. And then the big palace complex. Now, scholars usually call these the northern and western palaces. I'll come back to that in a second. Here's the casemate apartments, what they look like. So basically, there's what remains is about 70 apartments. They're 4 meters wide and range from 10 meters to 35 meters in length. So 35 meters, that's very, very long. And that could have been, barracks kind of accommodation. So the surface, the built structures are mainly palace complexes. Scholars typically call these the northern palace, the fancy one hanging over the north end, and the big, boring western palace, which has just fancy rooms inside it. Josephus, however, only mentions one palace, and I don't really think that the northern palace deserves to be called a separate palace. It's just there was a palace, and the northern part was the fancy part where you have this brilliant view. But you can see this very fine, finishing of like the benches and plastering and so on. And so that's how close they are, what scholars call the Western and Northern Palace. And one of the curious things in scholarship is that people criticize Josephus because he only speaks about the palace. And they say, well, there are two palaces there. But there's only two palaces there because scholars call them two palaces. If you see what I mean, all that big square stuff right in the center of the picture, just above the center, that's all storage rooms. So what they call the Northern Palace are these three hanging rooms off the front.
Mm-hmm.
But I would suggest there's no reason to call it palace. Those are just like party rooms and viewing spaces, right? If the big complex is the palace. So you can see there the palace is behind all the storerooms up there. And then I would argue these are just party rooms and, really spectacular rooms for visitors, but there's no accommodation in them. They're just places to eat and to look out at the great view there. So, as I say here in the caption, strictly for pleasure, there's no accommodation here, and there's no practical benefit. So why call it a palace? These are basically party rooms for friends to gather and have cocktails and look out at the great views. So, and you've got these brilliant bath complexes as well here, and commanding views all around, especially to where the trouble is most likely to come from, Jerusalem direction down the road. You can see for many, many miles. And you can see if anybody's trying to walk up the snake path towards you. So to come back to our question, why did the Romans want these from 72 onward, long after the Jewish wars finished? Well, Josephus says that when Bassus had been sent as legate in 71 or 72, he's the second legate after the wars finished, he brought over the fortress at Herodium, along with those who occupied it. And Josephus just says that. That's all he says, like in not even one sentence. So apparently it was very easy for him. It was near Jerusalem. He just showed up probably outside and said, okay, we're here. We want the fortress back. And they said, okay. Whoever was inside said, we agree with that. And they left. After he'd assembled the whole military, which was large but dispersed in units, along with the 10th Legion, which is now the legionary garrison of the new province of Judea, he resolved to bring the fight to Machaerus. It was absolutely necessary that this fortress be taken out so that it would not entice many to rebellion because of its strength. This is Machaerus, right? Not Masada. He's worried that if the Romans did not garrison Machaerus with their own forces, that people might be tempted to go and hang out there and feel they were, resisting Rome, not really part of the program. So he goes and besieges Machaerus. So here's what he did. He built a primary ramp. Well, he did what the Romans always do. He built a wall around the place, a circumvallation, with little camps around and towers to watch. Here's a diagram of it. So the primary ramp he built from the southeast. Then he built, these are the remains today of the circumvallation wall that have been found. He built a secondary camp to the northwest on the opposite side and began building a secondary ramp toward it. We know this because the remains of it are still there. And then along the wall, there were towers and bases at each point, 15 of these camps. You can see the remains of one of them there. All around the place, there's remains of another one. So there's the primary ramp, the secondary ramp. And clearly he was going to follow the primary ramp up and introduce his legions into the breach point there, into the town. It looks like the ramp was built on the rubble of the aqueduct. So he destroyed the aqueduct feeding water to support the people in the town, and built a ramp over top of it. And there is his second command camp on the northwest side and the secondary ramp. So he was going to attack from two sides. You can get a better view of the secondary ramp there, but it was never finished. So archaeology confirms that it was never finished. Why not? Well, because according to Josephus, the Judeans who had been received, Machaerus, distinguished themselves from whoever the others were there. So the people who took it over, the militants who took it over, treated the long-term residents there as a mere mob, as a know-nothings, to remain in the lower city and to risk the dangers. They themselves took over the fortress on the top and thought that because of the strength of its fortifications, they would be safe. They calculated that they could get a pardon from the Romans if they offered to yield up the site. Whether he's talking about below or the fortress site's not clear. Anyway, his point is that these guys were really calculating. They knew the Romans were going to come eventually for their fortress. They want their fortress back. And they made a calculation that they could get away safely if they said, okay, you can have it. We'll leave in peace. But these people have been there since 66. So he says that when the Romans showed up, actually, for the siege, they changed their mind and said, well, okay, that's a last resort. We can surrender. But, we're men, we're tough, we're Judeans. So let's see, first of all, if we can just drive them away, if we can convince the Romans to go away and not stay out here besieging us. This is what Josephus claims, right? We don't know whether it's true. It's just his story. But what he says is that because remember, he's really into Judean masculinity, toughness, and all that.
Right.
So he says they made spirited forays each day. And when they did this, they actually killed many Romans. So they would run out of their fortress and attack the besieging Romans who were trying to build their ramps. And they actually did away with many Romans. Inevitably, he says it was just a matter of, circumstance and who was the winning side. The Judeans, if they could fall on the Romans while they were unguarded, they would win. The Romans, if they could anticipate the attack and protect themselves, they would win. But then he says, among them was a certain young man whom he clearly admires by the name of Eleazar, same name as the guy at Masada, who was bold and daring and vigorous in strength. And he really distinguished himself. He would protect his comrades out there when they were fighting, and he would be the last one to go back himself. So here's the view of from the Roman camp, looking up at the hill and looking down from the summit to give you an idea of the topography, right? And now he says what happened was that one day Eleazar stayed too confidently, too long outside the walls and protecting his men as they went back, and he was actually captured. So the Romans said, we're going to crucify this guy to punish you all. And the Judeans said, please don't. We will give you the fortress if you will let us have Eleazar. According to Josephus, they bought this. The Romans said, okay, here, you can have Eleazar back. Now give us the fortress. And then, however, the people living in the lower town were not very lucky. They tried to get away at night, and they were captured and killed by the Romans. All of this is a little bit confusing, a little bit puzzling, but archaeology does confirm that the secondary ramp was never finished. And it looks like the place was never actually attacked. So some kind of a deal is not out of the question that they actually gave up the site and left. We're coming now to Masada.
Interesting.
Okay. But yeah, and this is really important, right? To realize that the Romans were not preoccupied with Masada. They actually put a higher priority on Machaerus because of its, even though it's a smaller, summit, its location is one that they didn't want Judeans hanging out in because it was a difficult location for them, right, to get to. So they wanted to take it over, and it was a higher priority than Masada. Now Josephus continues and says, well, when Bassus died in office out there in Judea, Flavius Silva was sent to succeed him, apparently in 73. He observed, well, every other place has been taken. There's only one fortress that remains still that's not, under our control. So he gathered his force from various places, and that fortress is called Masada, and he decided to march against it. But notice, unlike Machaerus, there's no urgency here. It's like Silva just, according to Josephus, arrives and looks around and says, well, what can I do now to, make myself useful with my army? There's one fortress left. Let's take that. It's the only one remaining. It's not the most important one. So what's the date of this siege? I'm saying the year 74. Why is that? Josephus claims that Masada fell on 15th Nisan, which is actually the first day of Passover in the spring. He does not make the connection with Passover, which is really odd. And it appears that the reason for that is he doesn't want to glorify what happened there. He doesn't really like what happened at Masada. Whereas at Machaerus, he really kind of gives these guys credit, first of all, for having a plan and being smart, and second, for the courage with which they fought, fought the Romans in impossible circumstances. He really gives them credit. He doesn't do any of those things with the crew at Masada. Why not? Well, the standard date for the fall, the traditional date used to be in scholarship 72 so that they said that the Romans arrived in 72 and besieged the place until 73. So it was a 6-month or more siege. And this was guessed at because of what comes before and after in Josephus' narrative. But actually, what comes before and after in Josephus' narrative doesn't have a clear date. So that's not a very strong argument. The main argument now that has come into play is that a scholar named Werner Eck found, well, he didn't find the two inscriptions. They'd been known for some time, but he studied them carefully. There are two inscriptions recounting the career of Flavius Silva, the guy who took Masada. And they were found here in Italy in his hometown, Urbs Salvia, which has a different Italian name today, but it was in the ancient world, Urbs Salvia. That's where he was from. And these two inscriptions were honoring the hometown hero, Flavius Silva, for all his achievements. And in that list of his achievements, it says that he was appointed praetor, and you have to be a praetor before you can be the governor of a province in 73, when Vespasian was censor. Or that's what it appears to say. Anyway, I shouldn't dwell too long on this. It's a technical matter. But the point is that if he was praetor only in 73, he could only have gone to Masada later that summer. Therefore, the spring, April, when Masada fell, must be the spring of 74, not 73. So a little bit of technical background. So how long did it last? We saw that Litwa thought it lasted like 3 years. He said, the Romans were out there trying to suppress the Jews at Masada for 3 years. More conservative estimates, 6 months. But this all assumes that the ramp that we see today was largely built by the Romans, right? That's been the common view. People say, look at, still today, I don't know how it was, Derek, when you visited Masada, if they said anything about that ramp, but it's often called the Roman ramp, right? So that's
I've got a video of it I'll show whenever we get,
Okay. I'm going to wrap up as soon as I can.
Oh, no worries. I'm just saying I have one that, like, some of this stuff is really cool. I've got visuals for, so.
Okay. But this idea seems to overestimate the amount of work needed on the ramp and underestimate the legion's efficiency in doing. So a scholar named Jonathan Roth has actually done this detailed calculation of how many man hours legions needed to produce siege walls and ramps and things like that. And it's a fascinating study, actually, because he uses all kinds of comparative material. And then, how many cubic meters of construction material was needed at Masada in order to do what was necessary, and then how many were available for forced labor. He estimates that actually, in the best case, everything clicked along, the legions only needed 4 weeks. In the worst case, 9 weeks. So he says, let's split the difference and say they only needed about 7 weeks to do what they did. And therefore, that would put the siege just from the end of February to April of 74. And that would make sense because the really nasty part of the year, if you're at Masada, is not, well, the summer is terrible because it's extremely hot, but the winter torrents really are dangerous. They come flooding by in late January, February. So it would actually make sense if they showed up after that in the end of February, and then we're done by April. So their approach to Masada was much like that what Bassus had done at Machaerus. That is to say, establish 2 main camps on opposite ends, right? One here to the north and one to the southeast, right? Those are the 2 command camps. And then you have the natural ramp, but there are only 8 camps here as opposed to 15 around Machaerus. That's because the terrain is much more manageable and open. Over at Machaerus, so it was all hilly, right, everywhere. And that's not the case here. And then they built a circumvallation to prevent escape. That's typical Roman behavior in a siege. You not only don't want reinforcements coming in, you also don't want the people besieged to just be able to leave at will. So you put up a wall to keep them in. And here are the famous remains of the visible camps around Masada. So here you can see actually quite clearly the commander's central part, the officer's mess. And about half of the 10th Legion could be accommodated here. And you've got these little barracks rooms, only 8 by 10 feet or so, for squads, what we would call a squad or a fire team in the modern military of 8 to 10 people. And there's Silva's headquarters camp over at Camp F, so-called, and those are the other ones. Now, it looks like, in contradistinction from Machaerus, that there's absolutely no evidence of fighting. And this fits with Josephus's narrative, right? You've got a bunch of families up there on the top. There's no material evidence of artillery, no stones or arrows found outside the summit. They were found on the summit. So there was incoming, but there was nothing found outside, outgoing. Contrast Yotapata, Gamala, where the people being besieged fought, and all kinds of arrows and stones and things were found. Josephus mentions no defensive effort, except that they reinforced the wall to help protect themselves against the final assault. Anyway, there's very little that they could have done, right, once the Romans arrived. These rolling stones, these rather large rolling stones, that's why we call them rolling stones, because they're big, have been found, but it's not clear what they could have been used for. In theory, you could roll them down the hill, right, to knock out somebody trying to come up the hill. But the problem is you lose control of them once you drop them down the hill. And then hundreds of these grapefruit-sized ballista balls have been found as incoming fire from Roman catapults. And hundreds of iron arrowheads have been found in piles, maybe used by the defenders, but also may be used in their raids to kill animals for food. It's not clear. And then more than 1,000 pieces of this kind of Roman scale armor have been found, but it's not clear what date they're from. It could be from the garrison that was there later, right, after the capture of Masada. Josephus' parallels between the 2 sites are really interesting because they're kind of structured the same way. He says, remember, he said that Bassus focused on this fortress, whereas Silva focuses on Masada. The reason for Bassus was its strength. The reason for Silva is just it's the last one. available. But both of them have steep drops on three sides and one access route. In both cases, he pauses to give the history of the site from King Herod's time. In both cases, he says the Romans filled up a ravine to get to the site. In Machaerus' case, the eastern ravine where the aqueduct was. In Masada's case, the natural ramp was built over. And in both cases, the leading man was named Eleazar. But he says of Masada's residents, they neither have a plan nor do they fight. The Judeans at Herodium and Machaerus surrendered and lived. But for some reason, the people on Masada don't do that, or in his story, they don't do it. They think the only option is killing themselves, which is curious, right? Why? And the big difference is that up at Masada, he focuses on talk. There's a lot of speeches. And there are two big speeches from Eleazar ben Yair. And you have to remember here that Josephus has a very dodgy view of rhetoric and fancy talk. He makes this clear elsewhere in his writing. He's well aware, as all ancient writers were, of the power of rhetoric. But like Polybius, he's very wary of that power. And he attributes it to the most unscrupulous enemies, right, that he has. He says they could talk their way out of anything. They could make the worst case appear the better one, which was a standard accusation against sophists, right? They could make any case plausible. So in his first speech, Eleazar, when the Romans breach the wall, and they're about, so they've set, as I mentioned, they've set the gate on fire, and they plan to enter in the morning. He says that overnight, Eleazar, who was maybe fevered and a bit crazy, decided everybody's got to kill themselves. So he summons the manliest or most courageous of his men and tries to persuade them, look, guys, we all have to kill ourselves now. And he gives them a short, pithy talk. He says, we vowed we would die before becoming slaves to Rome. Well, here we are. Our slavery is imminent if we surrender. And who knows what will happen to our wives and children in the hands of these Roman soldiers. So we all better just kill our families and kill ourselves. We misread God's purpose. We committed crimes, Josephus has him say in a big confession. So it's just time to be courageous and accept our penalty. It's time to die. And this is what Josephus says about the response to that little sermon. Pity for their wives and families got into the softer men. Seeing in each other also the certain and vivid reality of their own ends, they signaled by their tears their lack of agreement with the proposition. So we're basically, we're not so keen on this idea. When he saw these people acting like cowards and their souls collapsing at the scale of the plan, Eleazar became afraid that this lot would, with all their howling and crying, cause even those who heard his words with resolve to behave like women. So you can detect here Josephus's themes, right, about men behave like men, tough, strong. Right. Women behave like women, emotional, crying. This is kind of standard ancient stuff. So he did not relax his appeal. Instead of saying, okay, he said, no, I've got to give a better speech. So he raised himself up and, full of great purpose, made an effort with more brilliant words on the immortality of the soul. And now he gives a big, long speech in which he talks about Indian self-immolation and that really life in the body is the curse, and really we need to be liberated from. This is like this big Platonic, Stoic, philosophical speech. And then says, who could be so unmanly and life-loving that he has not repented of remaining alive before now? Who's not disgusted with living? And then he says, he wanted to continue with this exhortation. He was really getting into the spirit of it. But they cut him short. Filled with some uncontrollable urge, possessed by spirits, they went off, each one struggling to get ahead of the other, supposing this to be a demonstration of his courage and prudence, that he didn't want to be the last one to act. So great was their eros, their lust for slaughter of their wives and children and of themselves, that overcame them. So Josephus, I think it's clear, does not appreciate this kind of outlook. He's really making fun of these people in quite, forceful terms, that they actually were now in love with. They had eros for slaughter of their own wives and children. Instead of loving their wives, they were now in love with the idea of killing them, because of the power of Eleazar's oratory. And when it came to the deed itself, they were not cowed as one might have imagined. They were not, hesitant, but they pursued intently the result they had found while listening to Eleazar's words. So they hugged and greeted their wives, took their children in their arms, planting final kisses on them, welling up with tears. At the same time, as though this were being done by the hands of complete strangers, they carried out the plan on which they resolved, having the atrocities they would suffer from their enemies as consolation. In other words, saying, well, we would have had a lot worse. You would have had a lot worse if we'd been captured. So in the end, none was found unequal to such boldness, but they all ran through their closest relatives with their swords. Miserable victims of necessity, for whom the killing of their wives and children with their own hands seemed the least of evils. I would suggest to you there's absolutely no admiration here in Josephus. He's really presenting this in tragic terms, and not in a good way. Not sympathetically, saying this was really a bad idea. And I say that because many scholars have tried to find, have found in this speech somehow Josephus' admiration for these people. And I kid you not, I mean, that's in a number of scholarly studies that
Wow.
Josephus really found, he sort of at the end couldn't help but admire these people. I just don't think that explains the evidence that's there. I think he's really quite appalled by the whole situation. And that's how he presents it in his narrative, I think, as this is the end run of what happens if you have a cockeyed view of freedom that says you must have absolute political freedom. You won't be anybody's slave. Well, this is what it leads to, right? In the end, you have to just, bail out, end your life. Okay, I'm coming to the end now, because the question is what happened at the end, really. So here's the site again. Josephus's account is very vague and also simplistic. He basically says this: the hill was 300 cubits high. Silva built a ramp 200 cubits high, put a big stone platform of 50 cubits on top of that. A cubit is about half a meter, right? Well, a little over half a yard. And he put a siege tower 60 cubits high on top of that. So you can see the math works out that the siege tower would be 10 cubits above the summit, which would give them a little bit of room to see over the summit. That's how he presents it. The problem is that in reality, the terrain is not like that. The actual natural ridge is much higher. It goes, as we saw in the pictures, almost all the way up. And there's absolutely no evidence of a stone platform of 50 cubits high, so like 25 meters. That's a big old stone cube on which to rest the siege tower. And it's difficult to understand how on earth you would have gotten the siege tower up on top of that block anyway. Or Josephus never explained. He said the battering ram was used to batter in the gate before they set it on fire, but doesn't explain where that battering ram was. So here's again the situation there, And what archaeologists have found is that you've got some building yards where the Romans did their construction down at the bottom there. You can see the remains of the circumvallation wall, and there's a cutout hill called the Luce, the quarry hill. That Luce means white, so white stone was quarried out for the ramp from there. And you've got that conical hill, which is cut by the circumvallation wall behind that. And here's what the ramp looks like. You can see it's very narrow, right, along the ridge. That's what it looks like today, and from the sides, like this. Now, the present ridge is far too narrow and small for any kind of legionary operations, right? It's only like 2 meters wide in most places up there like that. So that's not happening, right? The ridge that's there now couldn't have done the job. So what's going on? Well, it's just too narrow, and it's still a little way from the summit. So how do you get the siege engines and the battering ram up over the summit? Well, we've got basically 3 scholarly views. The most traditional view, which we've already alluded to, is that a great deal of work was required so that the natural spur was very low, and at least 6 months of work was required for the camps and the circumvallation. And recall, Litwa said a 3-year operation. These 2 German scholars went there. They were the first to really spend time there back in 1934, before the Nazi rise, and everybody was their enemy. That this was the end of, well, Hitler was already in power, but in 1933, they went and stayed there, and then wrote up their results in 1934. Fascinating book. And they already realized the legions would have needed probably a 10-meter wide surface, not what's presently there. They posited massive erosion of the site, right? They said that's why there's so little there now. Now, a guy named Gill and the Roth that I mentioned, Jonathan Roth, they in 1993 and 95 argued to the contrary, that not a great deal of work was required above the natural spur. And this required some geological study of the ramp to see what was sort of native rock and what was added as fill. And as I've mentioned, Roth ended up saying, 4 to 7 weeks. Now, the most interesting and controversial bit of all this is Benny Arubas and Chaim Goldfuss have most recently argued that actually the ramp was never completed. And that, of course, makes a parallel with the Machaerus situation. And the reason they say that it was never completed is that the idea of massive erosion, which would require that 2/3 of the original Roman ramp eroded, isn't plausible, because it's not found anywhere else in the region. Like, there just isn't that kind of erosion. And 0 remains of any weapons or conflict, and no trace of the stone platform, and you can't figure out how the siege was done. So Schulten and Lambert, these guys in their 1933 stay there, they said, okay, it's like this, that what's visible there today is that blue line in the middle. The natural spur is the bottom part, and the Romans added everything in between, but a little bit of that has gone away in depth, but in width, a ton of it has gone away, right? So a great deal. But they did away with the stone platform idea in Josephus. They said that's not plausible because there's no evidence of it, and it doesn't make any sense. How can you put a big 50-cubit cube stone platform up there? That doesn't make any sense. But they came up with the idea that the siege ramp had an angled base, to like matching the angle of the ramp to get up to the top, right? And then they put the battering ram way up at the top of the siege tower. Now, this has been criticized as being kind of ridiculous, because you can't really match the bottom of the siege tower to a ramp like that and expect any kind of stability. right? It's just not going to happen. You want a flat basis. The Romans knew what they were doing, and they wanted stability in these things. Now, here's Gill's analysis from the geology. So he points out that all these colored bits here are the natural rock. That's what was already there. So virtually everything was already there. And then the Romans built it up, as Schulten and Lambert said, and a little bit of it has eroded, but they didn't need much. If you visit Masada today, at the bottom near the ramp on the east side, on the west side, for tourists, they have this reconstruction, and they use the angled base idea of. But you see here how precarious this looks. I don't know if you can see in this picture, but these soldiers, I wouldn't want to be them standing below this angled siege tower with a battering ram, right up near the top of it. It's very, very difficult to get at. Now, when they made the TV series, they said that's not going to work. So they actually just made a plain old battering ram. But nobody could figure out where it would go on the ramp, because Romans normally separated their siege towers from their battering rams. Siege towers were for firing weapons from, right, to get an angle over the walls, whereas a battering ram had to have this very secure flat base, right? It couldn't be perched up in the top of a siege tower. So Arubis and Goldfuss questioned the whole idea. This is why they think the ramp was never finished, because here's their reconstruction of what the ramp would have had to look like. It had been much wider across the top, like 10 meters wide, and therefore falling away at a much wider angle to the sides. And they don't believe that 2/3 of it could have disappeared, right? So virtually all that gone away.
Wow.
So what really happened at the end? Well, the way this question has usually been framed, nearly always been framed, is Josephus' account reliable? And he tells the whole story of, the speeches and the mass suicide and everything. So it's all treated as a package. And the question is his account trustworthy? Well, already after Yadin's book, immediately after Yadin's book came out, lots of people said, no, this is not plausible. Even though Yadin tended to support Josephus's account, at least in his public, popular book that he published. So especially true to Weiss Rosmarin argued in several articles in the 1960s against Yadin. She said, look, suicide, un-Jewish. Actually, Josephus must have been whitewashing a Roman massacre. That's what it is. Because at that time, Josephus was viewed as a mouthpiece of the Flavian regime, right? So that's what everybody thought he was. And so she said, well, look, he's just doing the bidding of his patrons. He doesn't want to say that they came and massacred everybody. So he made up the story of a massacre, of a mass suicide instead. So she figured that Silva's army must have, this is what Romans would have done. They must have stormed the summit and killed everybody, right? And then Josephus just fashioned this less damaging story to them. Louis Feldman responded to her and many others saying, well, the problem is Josephus could not have denied a Roman general, a high-ranking Roman, who would be a consul soon in Rome. If he had had a big military victory like that and defeated, killed, slaughtered the enemy, he couldn't, living in Rome, writing in Rome, he couldn't have just made up the story of a mass suicide, because that would have denied Silva, a major source of kind of credibility, right, and status, if he'd won a military victory and it was reduced. If he said, he didn't win a military victory because when he got there, everybody's already dead. He couldn't do that in Rome if he were fabricating it. So Feldman said, no, there must have been something to the story. There must have been a mass suicide. And then a middle view from Shai Cohen in a 1982 article, he agreed with Feldman that Silva must have approved the story But that didn't mean that it had to be true. So he kind of struck a middle ground. He said, yes, it is right that Silva must have liked the story for it to have been, made public. But that doesn't mean that it was the truth. So any story that presented Silva as a decent fellow and virtuous would have done the job, would have worked. So Shai Cohen argued that Josephus's story about the speeches, the overnight thing, the mass suicide, that's all pretty implausible. But he said it is possible that a few people committed suicide and that Josephus embellished this story in such a way that that Silva came out looking, smelling like roses, and that was enough for him. But this all assumes that we're asking that the question that we should be asking is Josephus' account reliable? If you've heard me before on historical method, you'll know that I don't think that's the right question. Historians are not supposed to be deciding which sources are reliable and which ones aren't. It's not what detectives do, right? When they're investigating a crime, they don't try to find, you're the reliable witness. No, they treat all witnesses the same way. They doubt all of them, and then they come up with their own questions and their own effort to find the truth. And that's what historians should do. So if we ask our own questions, for example, what are the possible scenarios that would explain all the evidence? And we're not asking, is Josephus right? Let's park his narrative for a moment and say, what's going on? What are the possibilities of the ending? Well, then we come up with different hypotheses that we can test and weigh. So, for example, I think it's very likely that Silva offered terms of surrender. In fact, Josephus refers to these. He has Eleazar refer we don't have time to look at it, but it's 7:383. Eleazar refers to a Roman offer of surrender that he rejects. And I think it's just most likely, given Jerusalem, given Sepphoris, given Neotapata, given Tiberias, all the other places the Romans were, Machias, that he offered. Why would he want to risk Roman soldiers if he didn't need to? If he wanted the fortress back, he simply had to show up and intimidate them, and they surrendered. So I think it's likely that he offered terms of surrender. If he did, then various scenarios are possible about what really happened. For example, his soldiers might have climbed the snake path. If anybody else could do it, remember that Judean irregulars, not professional fighters, had seized the site in the first place, Josephus said, from professional soldiers. So it was possible, surely, for a massive professional army to sneak some people up there during the night with all these families up there. Why couldn't such a massive legionary force overrun the families based up there just by sneaking up at night, over the snake path or one of the other routes? Then you have a problem. Why would the inhabitants live in terror while they watch these Romans around them for weeks and months on end, building siege ramps and a circumvallation wall, and then just decide at that moment to all kill themselves? And how could they have predicted that the Romans would give them a night's reprieve while the gate was burning? That doesn't make any sense. If they had resolved on self-destruction, why wouldn't they have done it sooner? They couldn't have known that they would have that final night to pull it off. So here, there are all kinds of, the point I want to make is there are all kinds of possibilities. I don't know what happened, and neither do you. Nobody knows what happened because we weren't there. But there are lots of possibilities we can imagine. So Silva raided the place by stealth, maybe murdered some, as the Judeans had in 66, maybe via the snake path. Maybe he stopped construction of the ramp, as Arubas and Goldfuss think, because of an earlier suicide. Or maybe the residents up there attempted a breakout, like those people from Machias. I didn't finish that story, but they went off to a grove by the Jordan River And Josephus claims they were later surrounded by Roman soldiers, and then they attempted to break out, and they were killed. But we know, for example, from the death camps, Treblinka and Sobibor in the Second World War, that when the prisoners knew that they had no choice, they knew they were going to be killed, they actually just said, "We're going to go for broke and break out," and some survived. So maybe they tried it. Maybe many were captured, killed, or released, or maybe they surrendered. Maybe they were invited to surrender, and they did surrender, but something went wrong. Maybe some soldiers got out of hand. Maybe Silva got angry. Maybe some of his soldiers got angry, killed some people. Here's what I'm coming back to Shai Cohen's logic, which I think is right. The story just needs to have been one that Silva could live with. So if Silva and his soldiers had, for example, violated a pledge of safety, or a raiding party had killed women and children sleeping, something very inglorious, or something else went wrong, he might have preferred Josephus's version to what had really happened. It doesn't need to have been the truth. It just needs to have been a story he could live with. So now I'm finishing.
I love this, by the way, so thank you.
What we're doing as historians is we're just trying to explain evidence, right? That's it. And the point is, we don't know what happened. There's no payoff in attaching ourselves to conclusions as matters of faith, right? That's not the role of history. It's not church. Historical understanding requires trying to figure out a bunch of things. So first of all, we need to consider all the fortresses together, not Masada alone. Masada was not an isolated case. It was one of the three remaining fortresses the Romans wanted back. The Judeans had taken all of them, but they took them in 66 from hated auxiliary garrisons, probably not Roman legionaries, but from the Samaritan auxiliary that held them. And they went to them to flee the fighting, to get away from conflict, not to fight. And Masada, at least, was mainly, it's clear from archaeological and literary evidence, for families. It was a place of safety for families. People raised, they had babies, they raised children there, they got divorced there, they led family lives. They hoped to live there as long as they could, and they succeeded for 8 years. 8 years, they managed to live there free of any conflict in Jerusalem or from Romans. So they may well have felt that, we've got this far. The war has been over for 4 years, right? So we're home free. We're safe now. It was not a useful place for fighting for the Romans anyhow. Why would you go there to do that? If you want to fight Romans, you stay, in central Judea and you hide in the hills and fight them from there. But there's no evidence actually of guerrilla warfare in the Judean War, which is quite interesting. The Romans, from their point of view, simply viewed all the fortresses in their province as assets they had to control sooner or later. And so they methodically planned to take them back after the war and, expel whoever was living there. Bassus planned Machaerus because it was the most important of the sites. And then later, he didn't get around to Masada. He died. When Silva showed up, he said, "Okay, so I'll take Masada." But the Romans were in no hurry. Machaerus was the more important. And they only did this at a late point. So one possibility, which has been raised by a couple of scholars, and I think this is quite plausible, is that these were also largely training exercises for the 10th Legion. You have to remember that there was no basic training, basic combat training, or maybe boot camp, Marine boot camp, anything like that. Legionaries trained on the job. They were hired, recruited, and then they went to their legion, and that's where they trained. So they had to be trained in siege engines, building ramps, walls, camps. How do you get that training? Well, something like this would be a relatively easy job. You're not actually fighting an enemy, an enemy army. you're simply liberating these fortresses from their residents who are non-professional. They're not professional soldiers. A bunch of families up on the top of Masada is not a military conflict. So that seems like a plausible explanation. They just wanted their fortresses back, and they came eventually to Masada, families there, and then something went wrong. Maybe the families surrendered, maybe some people were killed, whatever it is. Silva came out maybe not looking so well, and Josephus had a story that suited his aims to say that collective self-destruction is the end of this radical freedom program, and it suited the Romans' aims to say that. So the notion of Masada as a place for the last holdouts, and especially called zealots, fighting a rearguard action against Rome, is highly implausible. It doesn't explain any of the evidence, I think. Okay, that's what I had for you. You still there, Derek?
Wow. Yes. Yes. I am going to come to you and me now. Can you see me? We got to tilt your screen whenever you.
No, I can't see you. So I'm
okay.
going
You're still
to...
sharing your screen. I think that's why.
Right. So okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me go to Chrome here and stop screen sharing. Okay.
Okay. I am going to show a few things real quick. Then we'll do Q&A because I know that it's getting late there in Rome, and I don't want you to be up too late. Just for the, you know how it is. Entire screen. Yep. I'm sharing my entire screen just in case this gets a little here. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, so this is Dr. James Tabor. Of course, I took a trip with him. We were up here. Forget the audio. In fact, I'm going to turn the audio off, and I'm just holding my camera. Is that coming through smoothly?
Yep.
Okay, so I like a few things you said during this, right? I got Neil, Gnostic informant, right there on the other side of James, right there. We're looking off the west wall here near where they claimed the second palace or whatever one of the palaces is. But I'm looking at the forts. You can still see the Roman, like where their forts were, where their encampments were. And it's a little bit surreal. I mean, it even me, I try to put myself in their shoes, and I freaked out in my head, not only the height, but these people are like ants that will inevitably come and eat me alive is how I imagined it. It was freaky. So here I am. I'm going to fast forward a little bit because everybody's coming over here to give you an angle to show people this is that path. And I'm like, how is this what they actually came and conquered? Because it seemed like so much was missing. I was like, how did they get up here? And like, were they not going to find resistance on this narrow path? Would the warriors at the top not have kept them from like making it up there? Like, hey, safely move sand all the way up here or dirt. I just couldn't imagine how they would have been able to do that logistically. Standing up there, I would have fought with all I had. And so there's that image I wanted to show you. Of course, you know all about it because you've been there. And I wanted to show our audience to just get an idea of what we were looking at. Here's another one. This one was cool because it shows you how much water they could have kept. Like, let me turn my audio off. I'm going down into the largest cistern here to give people an idea. Here we go.
Now, this is just to clarify, to link up with what I said. This is an above ground. This is a summit cistern.
Right.
As distinct from the 12 cisterns that are cut into the side of the hill where there's little evaporation. So the water would be apparently brought up from those other cisterns as needed to the top.
Right. Just to show everybody down in here, it's huge. I've got Neil over here, Gnostic informant. We're in that. That's all of this is to store water. This massive, massive thing. There's my beautiful queen. And she's over here. She's all into it. We're having a hoot, enjoying ourselves here. And I just thought this was amazing how they would have done this. The engineering involved was just almost like how. Here was I think it was the synagogue at the top, or at least the one of the houses here, Dr. Tabor. Here's some of those. Let's see here. Scrolling up here, we're going into, and you can see the blue line. I think that was where dirt was before they excavated.
Yeah.
So we have an idea of how much they actually cut. The blue line on the left, for anybody who's not noticing that. Now we're about to go into the synagogue that was on top, right here. We had to wait for these groups because they were literally like, a lot of them were doing like sermons and singing songs and reading from the Gospels and stuff. Like, it was like tour groups are like really, really like all over this place. So it's a little frustrating. I'm not going to lie.
What time of year were you there?
That's a good question. I think this is 4 or 5, maybe 6 months ago. Here's one of those houses that I think you were describing, the soldiers would have lived in. And one of the window cutouts here, that look, I didn't know I was afraid of heights to some degree till I was up here, and I was thinking, holy smokes, this is high. It was just a whole nother level of me thinking, what if the side of this thing just breaks and I'm free falling? I'm done. I'm done. So there was the little house. There's a lot of other videos. I just wanted to tease some people here. Here's another one. This just the sight, it freaks me out getting too close to that edge. I just wanted to give people something there. There's so many shots too that you could look at. But anyway, I've got a lot of footage here to go through and edit. And it was really a game changer for me to understand, like being there, looking off and going, these guys are trying to go up. And I like your snake path idea, at least, or speculating on how they probably got in there. They would have done it in a more covert way, because that path, while they may have actually been building that, obviously, to get up there, I was thinking about how much would have had to go into this, more than what we see, to get up there. I think you're probably right about it being incomplete. I just don't see it. I thought it would take twice, 3 times as much as what we're seeing here. I see it happening. I see the making of it, but I don't see how this would have been enough, unless it was just a few soldiers trying to get over the wall somehow and then open the gates or something. I don't know. I just couldn't see how they would, especially not get up there with the tilted piece of equipment. Are you kidding me? That was nuts. I don't know why that's even on the table.
Yeah, it's amazing what we can believe.
Yeah. I mean, I get it for the temple in Jerusalem. I mean, you're dealing with a fixed structure. Yes, there is that valley right there where the graves are, and I get that. But like, there's plenty of sides where it's not this. That is insane of a slope. Anyone who's ever been there, you'll be like, what the heck? It's beautiful, though. I really enjoyed it. And James Tabor is awesome. So if anybody ever in the future is like, I want to go on a tour, James is. I'm also planning, Dr. Mason, to potentially put together a MythVision tour to the Holy Land. You know, anyone and everybody. I don't care what you believe, what you think. It'll be interesting to maybe have an academic or two join us on the trip. And the sites we see, hopefully they have some expertise on, so that you're getting commentary from like the leading historians, scholars on the topics, and then you're not getting the oh, this is really where Jesus was actually crucified. And like, you know how much they play you when you go over there. There's 20 different areas where Jesus literally was and what happened. And I like the critical, skeptical, scholarship that goes with it. So
yeah, great.
Okay. Let me blast through these, because I know you have some answers for them, and I don't want you to have to spend too much time on them, but I want everybody to get their question. Scott Duke, thank you so much. Says, Bring On Courses by Steve Mason. Already been talking to him about it, and I'd love to make it happen. We'll have to figure out the logistics of where, when, and how, but if Dr. Mason's on board, I would love nothing more than that. He made Josephus come alive for me.
Thank you, Scott. Much
I've enjoyed all his appearances in MythVision.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott. Yeah. And he appreciates it too. Trust me, I hear about it. Teresa Wassinger, forgive me if I butcher your name. Thank you so much for the love and support. And you said, love Dr. Mason, my favorite scholar.
Thank you. You're very
Look at
kind.
that.
Thank you.
We're starting off good here. Doc Pluromina, thank you for the super chat. Do found fragments of sectarian scrolls at Masada suggest the Essenes were in fact a militant movement despite Josephus's whitewashing depictions to quell Roman uneasiness?
Yeah, the sectarian fragments, that's a really informed question. The problem is whether you identify. So there have been some scrolls found at Qumran that have connections with Masada, and vice versa. Scrolls found at Masada that look like scrolls from Qumran. What to do about those? Well, it depends on how you understand Qumran in the first place, what kind of place it was. And this today is ever more increasing conflict, in scholarship. It used to be a very simple view. Everybody pretty much, with a couple of outliers, thought Qumran scrolls were by an Essene community and everything was kind of sewn up. Now it's all over the place. I'm among those who doubt, not deny, but doubt, just because I'm skeptical about everything, I suppose. But in terms of explaining the evidence, I'm not so clear about the connection between Essenes and the Qumran site or the Qumran scrolls. But then, even those many of my colleagues who do favor some version of that connection, they're still quite open, increasingly open to the idea that the Qumran caves have a library of scrolls, many of which are not from the site, many of which are not from a single community, but it's a library of collected scrolls. So how you put that together with the observation that some of the scrolls found at Masada have traits, similar to those of the Qumran scrolls, then we're getting an increasing number of variables, right, to try to control in each case. So I don't have a good answer, but I don't think it says anything about the Essenes, because I'm not sure there's even an Essene connection with Qumran.
There, and by the way, you've probably been there countless times. I've only been once, but knowing the geography and the distance between where Qumran is, where the caves are, to the Dead Sea, having that in mind, following the road all the way down to Masada, 25 minute, 30-minute drive from Qumran to get to the Masada. We never went to the other side, of course, the Dead Sea. I did get to float in it, but I didn't get to go over there onto the Jordanian side. But it's really interesting when you know the place and you've been there and you've seen it to talk about what we're talking about here. It brings life to it. So, Doc, interesting question. Maybe it's still up for grabs.
Yeah.
J-Nick, could the Judean-Roman War be viewed as an apocalyptic event by the Jews and or early Christians?
Yeah, for sure. Certainly, the Mark 13, the apocalyptic discourse, seems to refer to if you date it before the fall of Jerusalem, to an impending event that's a conflict with Rome. Certainly talking about people fleeing, the city, and that's when the end comes and things like that. So yeah, definitely. Then it depends what you mean by apocalyptic. Christians didn't view it as the end of the world. Obviously, they viewed it as the end of Judaism, the end of Moses' law, or many Christians did. They took what's called a supersessionist view and said that, Christianity superseded what the Jews had because their thing ended with the fall of Jerusalem. So it was apocalyptic in that sense. Many Jewish texts, not many, a few Jewish texts, like 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, are written just after the fall of Jerusalem, are usually considered apocalyptic texts. And, somehow the fall of Jerusalem was a watershed event. So yeah, it's really ripe for apocalyptic interpretation because it's it's a catastrophic event. Sorry, I'm losing my tongue control now after
It's
talking
okay.
for so long. Yeah, so definitely it could be seen that way. Yes, absolutely. But that was not the final view of either Jews or Christians. For Jews, the rabbinic movement developed out of that, and the rabbis rejected apocalyptic visions of the future, and Christians built on the platform for the expansion of Christianity. So neither ended up viewing it as a kind of decisive end term event.
And before I forget, is there any way we can do, if you've extensively done the research on it, the Bar Kokhba revolt and that whole bloodbath and war and what led up to it and what were the, all the effects of what happened maybe one day?
Yeah, yeah, it's
Okay.
entirely possible. Yeah.
I'd be interested in doing that. That would be, because we never really dug into that. Doc Plurum on that again. Did Origen and Eusebius have a copy of Slavonic Josephus? Seems they were upset he was suggesting the fall of Jerusalem was due to the death of James or an Oblias and not Jesus.
Yeah, yeah. I think the Slavonic Josephus is now dated pretty confidently to the 13th century. And there was, for a long time in the 1920s and early 30s, there was speculation that even if it's a very late text, it draws, because the Slavonic Josephus, for those of you not familiar with it, it has a bunch of material in it that is not in Josephus's Greek text. And some of that is really fascinating from a Christian point of view. And the question was whether some of it connects with, say, the lost Aramaic version of the war that Josephus refers to that preceded the Greek version. So there were various lines of speculation. Robert Eisler, and then more recently in Nodé in Jerusalem, have argued for some connection there. The vast majority of scholars, and I would locate myself here, think that the Slavonic Josephus as a 13th century version incorporates embellishments of Josephus's war rather than early material that's been lost. So short answer to your question, Doc, is I think not that what's going on with Origen when he says that Josephus blamed the fall of Jerusalem on the death of James, and says he should have blamed it on the death of Jesus. I think he's just we're quite familiar with this. He's manipulating the text. So Josephus brings up the death of James, of course, in Antiquities 197 to 203, and he says, this was a terrible, Josephus says, this was a terrible miscarriage of justice by this guy, this Sadducean high priest. And then later, a few paragraphs later, he says that all these things, were causes of the destruction of Jerusalem. I think what Origen is doing is a little bit mischievous. He's simply eliding all that stuff and linking up James with the fall of Jerusalem. So he's spinning. Yeah, he's spinning. But Eusebius does the same thing, not with that case, but with many other cases. And then, of course, Pseudo-Hegesippus in the 370s, reworks Josephus' narrative entirely to make it talk Christian, which is quite bold. So anyway, I think that's more likely what's happening. Is not that Slavonic material has been lost. It's rather that these guys are spinning.
Yeah, and then that happens all the time. It's all about us, and it's our group, and it's our center. Whatever group it may be. If it's Islam, Jesus was a Muslim. If it's whatever the group may be, everything becomes about that particular central focus. So, Moseon, forgive me if I'm butchering your name, Mousion.
No, I think it's not a real name. I think it's Museum Lyceum or like Lyceum. It's
okay.
So the Museum of Alexandria and the Lyceum of Aristotle.
Look at that. See, I'm glad I have you here. Do you think
I've heard
material
some
was removed?
yeah, that we are missing sections. Yeah, I mean, it's possible. Anything's possible. The question is, how do you explain the evidence? What's the evidence for it? So it's not really a matter of what I believe or don't believe. I think that it's most likely that one word was dropped from the passage on Jesus, where the current text says he was the Christos. I think it's most likely, as Alice Whaley has argued quite effectively, I think, that Josephus originally wrote he was believed to be, or he was called, something like that, the Christos, and that has dropped out. But large-scale omissions, I don't know of any evidence for them. It's entirely possible. Anything's possible, but I don't know of any evidence for large-scale omissions from Josephus. The problem with these texts is that they're so important to understanding the origins of Christianity and ancient Judaism that you have just a massive views all over the playground, from scholars arguing this has been added, that's been removed. I think this happened. Oh, clearly that happened. The Flavians invented Christianity.
Right.
You just got views coming out of every kind of conceivable corner. And the question is, okay, fine, but how does that hypothesis explain all of the evidence? Let's sit down. And the only way you can get to it is by sitting down next to each other and studying the text, saying, all right, what does your hypothesis explain here? So anyway, that's why I don't think there's anything that needs that explanation, but there's nothing in principle to prevent it. It's entirely possible.
Thank you so much. Kathy, thank you for the super chat. Watched Luke Acts Josephus video. Does Marcion's Luke display the same dependence on Josephus? Dr. Mason is fantastic. I rewatch his videos.
Well, thank you, Kathy. That's genuinely really encouraging. As you can imagine, very gratifying to know that these are helpful. So thank you. Marcion's Luke. Well, that's a good question. I haven't thought of it. I haven't really tried to work it through. So I just have to tell you, I don't know. I don't know. It's a short and sweet answer to your question. I'm sorry I can't be more helpful. But Marcion's Luke, of course, is, I think it's generally agrees, it's not. So with Luke, you have an interesting transmission history, right? If you accept the Q hypothesis, there's Q, and then some people, including myself, think that Proto-Luke is a nice idea, would explain a number of odd features of Luke. If there was a Proto-Luke, that is, as the author wrote it with Q, but before he encountered Mark, because Mark is sort of added in chunks in Luke. Unlike Matthew, which uses Mark as a base and then it elaborates Mark and changes Mark. Luke uses it in a very different way. So then there's Proto-Luke. So I would distinguish between something like Proto-Luke, if it existed, it's a hypothesis, and Marcion's Luke, which is, I think most people would agree, after the fact. So he's trying to edit Luke to make it less Jewish and more Pauline. So I honestly don't know how his version of Luke would line up with the hypothesis of influence from Josephus.
Thank you, Kathy. I appreciate it. Again, with the museum, Dr. Mason, can we get you to consult on a real good show or movie trilogy that covers this Roman Judean drama from 63 BC to 135 CE? Would be amazing.
At first, I thought you were asking my advice about a good show or trilogy that covers this period, but I think you're asking would I be willing to consult in the creation of such a thing? How do you read that, Derek?
I read that yeah. Would you consult, like, would
be
for
a
a really good
consultant
show?
Yeah, sure. In principle. Yeah, and I agree with you that this would be great. The part of the problem is, again, would be the well, it could be an asset, things that are controversial could be attractive, I suppose.
Mystery.
But yeah, almost anything is likely to attract a lot of controversy. I mean, just look out any film that comes out now, pretty much is attracting controversy for one thing or another. Somebody's going to feel their ox is being gored. So, yeah, but in principle, sure. I think it's absolutely fascinating stuff. And of course, then the problem is you have to come up with a narrative. And this is what many historians like me are reluctant to do, is to come up with a clear kind of authoritative seeming narrative, because there's so much we don't know. So you end up having to take a lot of liberties to fill in the gaps, right, from research. But yeah, I mean, in principle, consulting, yeah, it had nothing to do with trying to write or direct, but responding to questions or something like that, yes, sure, sounds interesting.
Thank you so much. Core Hill, Truth Seeker, how do you think the Romans, thank you for the super chat, how do you think the Romans generally saw Yahweh? When Hadrian built the temple to Jupiter in Jerusalem, was it to humiliate Yahweh, or was it supposed to be like Baalbek, meaning a temple to honor both Jupiter and Yahweh?
Well, good question. Somehow I think this name also is not probably the one the parents bestowed, Truth Seeker, the family name. Good question, though. This raises your question about a session on the Bar Kokhba revolt and the Aelia Capitolina. The short answer, I don't think there's a lot of stuff around about how Hadrian, hated the Jews and wanted to wipe out their memory, the memory of Yahweh with the temple to Jupiter, Capitolinus. I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that. And if you try to situate Aelia Capitolina in Hadrian's building program and his travels in 130 CE, I think there's other pictures are more plausible. I mean, Jerusalem was in ruins, right? It had been in ruins for 60 years. That's a long time. That's 2 generations, right? It's already just lying in ruins and occupied by the 10th Legion. So if Hadrian's around cruising through the area and, and building stuff all over the place, also in Samaria, in Galilee, why wouldn't he want to build a new temple in Jerusalem? And it's been speculated with some reason, I mean, some little bits of evidence, that he actually first thought of rebuilding the Jerusalem temple there. And this is evidence from the Epistle of Barnabas, for example. It's by no means clear, by no means agreed by scholars. But anyway, it's possible. We really don't know, but I don't think it's plausible or immediately plausible or compelling that he really had a strong animus against the cult of Yahweh. I think he did have, he wasn't so thrilled about the Flavians dominating the scene and their big kind of scam that they pulled in making such a big deal of destroying Jerusalem. I think he wanted to, I mean, that's why he named it after his own family, right? He was getting rid of, and he renamed the province now. It's now Syria Palestina, right? Getting rid of the whole Flavian thing. So I think, and it's a 2-legion province now under a consul, an ex-consul rather than a praetor. So I think that he had, his motives are all in the direction of himself and wanting to get rid of on the Roman political scene, wanting to expunge the Flavian domination of the whole thing. That's what seems more plausible to me. Yeah. I don't think he lost any sleep at night worrying about Yahweh or the Judeans. I think he was much more concerned about Roman politics. Yeah.
Thank you. JH, Thank you for the super chat. Hosea 9, when I saw your fathers, it was like early fruit on the fig tree. Because of their sinful deeds, I will drive them out of my house. Ephraim is blighted, root withered. They yield no fruit. That's your fig tree source. So I have read this in Mark when we were talking about this. If you take it literal and you think that Jesus did it and they didn't know what the heck he was doing. Oh, hold on. It's out of season. And I just cursed it. Obviously, that seems not to be the point. I imagine this is a jab at the Jews in Jerusalem in some way.
I'm not so sure, because I mean, of course, everybody wants to find a nicer explanation for this apparent nonsense. But the thing is that Matthew, in reading it, apparently thought it was nonsense and therefore changed it. Right? He didn't just take it over; he changed it to make Jesus not look quite so arbitrary as to curse a fig tree for not bearing fruit out of season. And as I said, that's not alone by any means. And this author doesn't have a very solid grasp of Scripture. I mean, he misattributes passages in Scripture, which again Matthew fixes up, right? So I'm not so inclined to think that he had this kind of profound grasp of what was in Hosea 9 and was applying it. I think he operates at a little bit more superficial level. And like with the woman, who touches his cloak, and Jesus is all confused. Who touched me? Who took power from me? I just don't think. I should stop there. I don't needlessly want to offend people. But
no, you're not in a place. I don't think you're going to offend anybody. We're very critical of Gospels. I even had Dale Allison, just the other day when he was making a comment about this. He said the prophets did silly, what looked like dumb, mundane things sometimes to get a point across, and so on the inside in his head, he may have been, if you take this historical, which I'm so question mark on anything here being really what is going on, but he might think there's a memory here where Jesus is yelling at a fig tree. Prophets did silly, dumb stuff, screamed at a river or whatever it might be. And you're like, well, what the heck is this all about? Thus saith the Lord. And I don't know. I was even thinking about the Masada scene as some Jim Jones narrative. I mean, they're over here talking about mass suicide on the top of the hill. But anyway, you never know, right? So I'm not trying to offend anyone either, but I'm looking at it.
Well, to come back to Mark, I should clarify what I mean. I'm not saying that Mark did not have a higher reason for telling the story. I do think that he wanted to make, I think, a fairly crude criticism of Israel, of Jews for not bearing fruit. I do think that's right. I do think that was the symbolic meaning. I simply mean the way he told the story is kind of crude, and that Matthew just drops out, if I recall correctly, that it was not the season for figs, because it just sounds weird to say that,
He's screaming at a withered tree that doesn't have fruit on it for the reason that it's not the season. Duh. Yeah. Right. It kind of sounds silly. I get it. Museum's back again. Do you see any comparison between the infighting of factional groups in the recent Syrian civil war and the Roman Judean conflict in 66 to 74? For example, being trapped between brutal regime and zealots.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the brutal regime part. That is, if the Roman regime is meant, the Roman Empire is meant. Again, this is a kind of standard idea that the Romans were just awful, brutal people. But I actually think that Jerusalem prospered under Roman rule in a way that no other city in the region did. So I wouldn't call their regime brutal. They could be brutal, at times, but so can, with all due respect, the Americans, or other people with power. You can be quite brutal to those who are your enemies when they become your enemies. But if they're your friends, as Jerusalem was a friend of Rome, an ally of Rome for a long time. I don't think the Romans were particularly brutal towards it. Anyhow, yes, I think I don't. I think we should always be cautious about parallels from one time and place to another one in any full sense, because the situation's always very different.
Right.
But these recurring human situations. So, for example, I think when you read Josephus, I'm always amazed at his kind of psychological insight and the way, whether he's actually talking about realities that everyone would recognize or it's just his view of things. Still, this idea that people who proclaim freedom and liberation to their people and then tyrannize those people in the name of liberation. So I'm liberating you from that awful power outside. And to do that, I need to tyrannize you. I need to control you. That happens to be a recurring, fact of life. You can think of many regimes, for example, pushing against the British Empire as the awful, foreign power, but the people doing the pushing against the British Empire weren't always necessarily agents of liberation, for their people. And this is true, I think, of it's just a common situation, right? Everybody wants to rule the world, as a song,
Good
from
song.
the past said. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. When people get when we all get in positions of power, you need to look no further than university administrations. When people get power, they do strange things with it, and they are willing to subject those to that power to show who's boss. Even though, if you ask them, their motives are all about sweetness and light.
Yeah. Thank you for that
Yeah.
super chat. The next one, brother unaligned. Sorry about off topic, but could Dr. Mason ever think of doing a podcast analyzing the religious themes of El Cohen music, especially the album You Want It Darker? Would love to hear that. I remember Dr. Mason being a fan.
Yeah. I mean, not only because I'm Canadian, but Leonard Cohen is. He was the man. He was, I played saxophone, and I just really love to play some of Cohen's tunes. "Dance Me to the End of Love," "Hallelujah." These are just brilliant pieces, and you get lost in them. You just get lost in them. It's fantastic stuff. But no, that's the answer to the question. Probably I should not taint the great man's legacy by trying to analyze the religious themes. I've heard Cohen interviewed a few times, and if I understood him correctly, he himself didn't know what the words meant half the time. That is, in terms of substantive meaning, right? They're clearly they're carefully chosen. They're evocative. But like "Closing Time" or many of these songs, if you try to put together, Suzanne, takes me down, she feeds me tea and oranges that come all the way from China. What are these words about? Well, who knows? I mean, I'm sure he had all kinds of ideas going on. But yeah, thank you, brother, for the suggestion. And it's a really lovely suggestion, but gosh, I think that wouldn't be wise on my part.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate that, brother. JC, and this was a question I wrote down, and you kind of answered it. But if Masada was site of murder suicide with perhaps a few women survivors, and Josephus not an eyewitness, where could he have gotten the story details?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good question. I think that he included the women and praised them in a way he did not usually praise women. Women are usually like the downfall, emotional, unreliable types. But he said that the one woman was not like all other women. She was much wiser and had much more insight. And I think the reason he's got them there is to explain how he got the information.
Right.
Because obviously, if everybody died, you don't get any information about what was said, the speeches, and so on. So I think he's giving himself an out. He does the same thing, by the way, with the Gamala episode of the siege. Everybody jumps off the cliff at Gamala. They hurl to they drop to their deaths, except 2 women survive to tell the story. So you always got to have. And why are they women? Probably because they could escape notice. Actually, it creates a funny situation. Funny, it's not the place to laugh because it's a terrible story, but it's a kind of a funny scenario at Masada. Like, the women are supposed to be relatives of Eleazar. Now, the whole plan is that the menfolk find their families, hug them, kiss them, and kill them. And then they lie down next to them. And then you've got 10 guys who are charged with going around killing all the men. And then they kill themselves in the end. So you've got this very strange scenario, if you think about it, of Eleazar saying, right, where are my women? I can't find them. They've gone off hiding somewhere. Oh, well, just get on with it. It's a strange scenario because the whole point of doing this exercise was to spare the women from being captured by the Romans.
Right.
So of course those women are captured and the children, and nothing happens to them. The Romans don't abuse them. So the whole thing turns out to be silly, a mistaken process. Wow. But it is a little bit funny that Eleazar just goes ahead when he can't find his women, when he's just told everybody else that they've got to do this to spare their women. But he doesn't look that hard for these.
Kind of a jab at him. Yeah. I don't want to get thrown sidetracked, but I think of Jesus being in Ananias. Like, how does he have all of this detail, and even to the point of when the stone falls? How does he know this? It sounds more literary. Not saying there couldn't be something to it. It's just,
and some of it I think is for literary and for humor even. I mean, that whole thing about the guy with the stone falling on him at the siege.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Tech Shot says, love when you get Dr. Mason on the show. I really appreciate that, Tech. Thank you so much. I think he enjoys it. I hope you enjoy these.
I enjoyed very much. I'm going to have to go because I've got another conversation coming up in 6 minutes.
Oh my gosh. Motorhead, thank you for the super chat. I just wanted to say thank you for being a member, Billy. Let me blast through these. Was Masada reoccupied after 74 by Roman elites?
By Roman soldiers, yeah.
Okay.
So there's a Roman garrison there, yeah.
Let me blast through so I can let you go here. Is Dr. Mason familiar with Dr. Eisenman's work, and what is his view on Judah the Galilean, fourth philosophy, and revolutionaries like Menachem, Eleazar?
Yeah, Menachem and Eleazar's relationship to Judas the Galilean. Josephus claims a relationship, genetic relationship of some kind. He says Menachem was a descendant of or son of Judas the Galilean. It's a little bit of a problem with the chronology there. There's a 60-year gap in their periods of flourishing. But anyway, I think my basic view is Dr. Eisenman's work, a little bit familiar with it. I come from a totally different angle. My historical method is very different.
Yeah.
So I have no reason to criticize his work. We just come from different places and therefore end up with different conclusions. I have a suspicion that Josephus links Menachem and Eleazar with Judas, mainly. Judas's two sons are actually killed in the 40s. So this gives you an idea. Josephus reports this in Antiquities under Tiberius Julius Alexander in the mid-40s. So this gives you an idea of the natural generations. So for him to have a son, Menachem, in the 60s, it's not impossible, but it's a little bit sort of Abrahamic, having a son in very old age, or a son who's very active in old age, one of the two. I rather think it's more likely that he's throwing this in to create a lineage wrong-uns,
Hmm.
of bad guys. Don't know.
Last two comments. I got to let you go. I just didn't want to leave him hanging. You don't have to give a long answer. Just saw Dr. Mason in an interview this morning, a couple hours ago on Naked Archaeologist. I also would buy a course. He's on here. It feels like a course in itself. Always learn from him. That's a fact. So we got to do a course sometime. And then the last one is this. I really appreciate it. Bradford Baldwin, thoughts on the void left in Jewish authority after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, creating fertile ground for rise of Christianity. Maybe it doesn't catch on if that doesn't happen. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, the classic story is, of course, that already during the siege, Titus allowed the Judean elites who had escaped to assemble in the coastal plain, and that eventually, soon after the war, Yamnia in Greek, became the center. So Yavne became the center of reconstituting, Jewish political life after the fall of Jerusalem. So that's what happens to the void in classical story. And it seems that that's basically, there's something to that. But scholars nowadays diminish the role of Yavne in all of Jewish political life a little bit. Sorry, I can't answer Bradford in more detail. Time has just run out.
You're fine. Dr. Mason, go ahead and bounce. I'm glad you hit those. I hate leaving people hanging. We will see you again, and I'm just going to do my little outro plug and take care, my friend. Let's connect again on more.
Yep.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, Derek.
Yes, sir. All right, Dr. Mason, everybody. I mean, he's very detailed. You don't find that. You don't find that often with academics, but he's very methodical, and I appreciate his skepticism and, of course, his insights. I know that you do as well, and I hope that everybody who's watching takes the time to go get some of his books. Go follow the academics, and especially if you're interested in the connections between Luke, Acts, Josephus. I'm a big fan of it. I've got some of his books in paperback and some on ebook. And I'm also, trying to do more. We got to cover some of these other subjects that he's done. So please go check him out. Check out our website as well for the course. I'm about to see what the poll says for those of you who have purchased one of the 3 courses we've done to see where we're at. And you can support us on Patreon as well. I won't keep you long. Let's see what this poll says and then go from there. I'm going to end the poll. And it should generate on the YouTube side, I think. Okay, it says James Tabor, 55% of you have watched it, and maybe you who voted didn't watch the others, don't know. M. David Litwa with the Mystery Cults, 26%, and then Dale Allison, Jesus Quest, 17%. There was 104 votes total. I like to do that. Please sign up for our courses. I love you. I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope that this message and what you heard today helped you put some pieces together or even created more questions that you're wanting to find out the answers to. And keep doing what you're doing. Let's get this outro going. Enjoy your day, everybody.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.